What's up guys, it's Chris, and I got my hands on the 6 best looking Chelsea boots I could find across 3 different price points. And I cut all of them in half. And that's because today guys, we're going deep. We're going to slow down and truly appreciate the subtleties of good craftsmanship. So if you care about details, quality, and fun party facts that nobody wants to know, you're in the right place. My name's Chris Madaras, and welcome to the most comprehensive video about stitched leather footwear on the internet. Today, we're going to review and compare all 6 of these boots, and in so doing, learn everything there is to know about high-quality Chelseas. Now, I didn't choose these boots just because they look good. They're all well-built and come from reputable independent makers, but more importantly, each one represents a distinct philosophy of boot making. Their construction, their design, the materials they use, how they're built, and what they're built for. I used to think Chelseas were simple boots, but putting these 6 together taught me just how unreasonably complex and diverse this one specific type of footwear actually is. And I bet you'll agree too. I'll tell you the game plan for this video, but first, here's the lineup. First up, we've got Bridlen Shoemaker. In my opinion, the most versatile boot here. Well-rounded on every beat and innovative in some, these work with warm weather, cold weather, jeans, all the way up to a fine suit. If I could only have one boot for every occasion without killing the wallet, this would be it. Next up, if you've ever wondered what technically perfect Goodyear welted construction looks like, TLB Mallorca has exactly that, wrapped in the most minimal design here. Beckett Simonon. Not only is this the most affordable boot here, but thanks to its lightweight, breathable construction, they're also my favorite for warm weather and stylish nights out. And then the polar opposite, Meermin. I love these dumpy-ass motherfuckers. Rugged winter weather, hardy, textured outfits, and rich, nappy suede. These are the affordable pick for when you need durability, but still want to look sharp. The most polarizing boot on this list goes to number 5, Blackbird. For just $345, these are fully handmade, plus come with a specialty leather that punches way above its price point. My goodness, just look at that B-roll. But it comes with a real caveat. And then Yearn Shoemaker, the pinnacle of design. Probably the best boots this world has to offer, under $1,000. But what actually makes a pair of boots worth $750? Well, I'll give you a hint. It has to do with this little gap here. Now, I've structured this video as 6 full reviews back to back with comparisons throughout. Each boots section follows this framework. First, we'll dissect the construction down to even the peculiar, subtle details that make each unique, and talk honestly about the pros and cons. I think it adds another thing too, and that's a huge pain in the ass. Then we'll cover the quality and purpose of every material used, with special attention to the most important one, the upper leather. But these aren't work boots, they're dress boots. They also need to look good, and that's why we'll cover every single facet of design, from the finishing of the sole to the density of the stitching to the nuanced geometric complexity of a high-quality last. And even the stuff I bet you've never thought about, like how the shape of the goring affects the entire aesthetic flow of the boot. And let me tell you, it's more than you think. You might think all boots look the same way now, but by the end of this video, you'll never see them the same way again. But boots aren't art, they're footwear. So how do these actually fit? What's the break-in like? I mean, it literally felt like my lower calf was in a PVC pipe. How do they fare in winter weather or breathe on a warm night out? And once they're on your feet, what do they actually look good with? We'll cover fit, comfort, break-in, breathability, weather use, and how to style each pair, from jeans and chinos to a 3-piece suit. And lastly, imperfections, because truth be told, none of these boots are perfect, and you should know why before you buy. Watching from start to finish will provide the most context from an educational standpoint. However, if you're just here for one boot, each section is structured as its own self-contained review, so you can skip straight to the pair you care about without missing a beat. Alright guys, let's get into it. This is the Chelsea boot in Bitter Choco by Bridlen Shoemaker. Bridlen's been around for a little over 30 years now and has historically sold mostly to Japan, though lately they are catching on in the US. And this boot is about to show you why. It's my personal favorite on this list, but not because it's got the lowest price or the cleanest finishing. It's got neither. It's my favorite because it's the only boot I know of around $400 that genuinely covers every base. The construction is robust, the silhouette is classic but refined, and the design details punch way above the price. But there's also a few genuinely innovative details that I just think are really cool. Let's start with construction. Now these are Goodyear welted construction, one of the most common forms of construction for high-end stitched leather footwear. As a brief primer, there are effectively 4 components to a welted boot: the upper, the insole, the welt, and the outsole. In Goodyear welted construction, while there are mild adhesives used, these components are held together by 2 primary stitches. The first is the welt stitch, which connects the insole through the upper layers through to the welt. Then you have the sole stitch, which connects the welt to the outsole, thereby connecting the entire boot together. And then the heel can be nailed on, screwed on, so on. Now, Bridlen is actually doing something quite innovative with their Goodyear welted construction here, but first, let me go over the pros and cons. There are 3 primary benefits to this method. Number 1 is watertight. So these boots, while they're not strictly waterproof, they are watertight. Whether you walk through a puddle, in the rain, or even dip them in a stream for a second, water will not penetrate the inside of these boots. And that's because the welt acts as a seal between the upper and the outsole, preventing any water from getting in. And because that welt stitch is not exposed to the outside, no water can wick up into it. Number 2, Goodyear welted boots are resolable. So when you wear through the sole of the boot from walking around, you can actually go to a cobbler and have that sole replaced, effectively restoring the life of your boot. This is why many people say Goodyear welted boots can last you a lifetime. And that's because if you properly maintain the upper, they reasonably can. This has economic benefits as well. For a boot like this that's almost $400, a leather sole can wear out in as little as 2 years if you wear them often, so having to spend just $100 to fully restore them as opposed to another $400 really helps the wallet. And then the last benefit is the cork filling. Because of the height of the welt, a gap naturally forms in the footbed between the insole and outsole. That gap must be filled with something, and it actually can be a variety of materials. It could be a foam, it could be more leather, it could be kind of a felted material. Typically, cork is used not just because it's cheap, but also because it does provide a real benefit of shock absorption, especially when it's quite thick as it is on this boot, which over tens, hundreds of thousands of steps starts to really add up, especially if you've got knee issues. As far as downsides, there really aren't any objective downsides, and that's because the one real downside is simply that Goodyear welted boots are going to be more expensive than simpler forms of construction like Blake stitch or cemented, though we will talk later about how Goodyear welt compares to some of these other forms of construction. Now on to what Bridlen is doing that is quite unique. In standard Goodyear welted construction, that welt stitch does not actually connect directly to the insole the way it does here. What it connects to is a white, stiff canvas rib called gemming. This gemming is glued to the insole and forms a vertical wall as an extension of the insole through which that welt stitch connects. What Bridlen does instead is a channeled insole where a slit is cut into the insole itself, peeled up, and forms that wall through which the welt stitch connects. There's a few ideas behind why this is superior. The first is that gemming is a bit stiffer and therefore will result in a more stiff boot, so a channeled insole will have a little more flexibility. The second is durability. That channel will never detach from the insole, but gemming certainly can. The third benefit, which I do feel a little more strongly about, is that having a channeled insole allows you to have a thicker insole. This skimming takes up a fair bit of vertical height, meaning the insole has to be fairly thin, otherwise you end up with a way too tall, way too thick footbed. The purported benefit of that is that a thicker insole will result in just a little more padding over time. It'll kind of mold to your foot a bit better. This all makes sense to me, though I don't know of any research done to verify these claims. Are the benefits real? Probably. Are you going to notice them? Probably not. Personally, I can't tell the difference between an insole with a channel or gemming. But to me, the real value is in appreciating the craftsmanship and the intention of the maker. A channeled insole itself is actually not innovative. It's something that handmade shoes, which we have a couple of on this list, already do and have done for a very long time. What's innovative is Bridlen has actually re-engineered Goodyear welting machinery to do this. And even if the benefits aren't substantial, that theme of experimentation is part of why I think Bridlen's a really cool company, and it's something we will see more of. So that's how these boots are made, but what's actually in them? Starting off with materials, we've got a full grain leather outsole with a closed channel stitch, a half leather, half rubber top lift, and a full grain leather heel stack. This is already a great start, right guys? You want to see full grain leather for these primary components. You don't want to see leatherboard. You don't want to see plastic or any kind of synthetic material. That leather will just hold up better over time. The combo top lift gives you the traction of rubber with the class of leather. The closed channel outsole is really cool. The way they do this is they actually cut a slit into the outsole, flip it up, make that outsole stitch that connects the sole and the welt, and then glue that flat back down. It's both an aesthetic thing, but also will help with the durability just to protect that sole stitch for a little bit longer. The flexibility here is actually not great. It is the stiffest footbed of all the boots, mainly due to its thick, tanky build. We'll talk more on this in the comfort section, but briefly, it's not that bad as far as boots go, but the sole does take a few days to break in. Moving up, the cork layer is very thick and also packed tightly all throughout. You don't want to see any big gaps where cork hasn't been filled in, where it can displace or cause you to have an uneven footprint. And then we've got this little black insert here. So this is very peculiar. In very high-end footwear, guys, you often have what's called a fiddleback waist, which is where the waist of the sole is sculpted up to either a narrow ridge or even just a round hump. But it's also really hard to do, which is why it's usually really expensive, because it's made using skived down leather. Bridlen has imitated this effect, having that rounded portion, but they've made it affordable by using this fiberboard insert. Now, there's something to be said about doing high-quality, expensive things in a way that's cheap and gimmicky. I personally don't think that's what's going on here. Even though it's doing it in a cheaper way, the effect it's having isn't cheapened. And so really what it is, to me, is a way that Bridlen is bringing a high-end feature down to a more affordable price point. Really cool. I feel like people are going to get mad at me for glazing the hell out of this, but this is so cool to me. I love this kind of thing. Anyways, we've got a thick vegetable pit tanned full leather insole and then the combination leather steel shank. The steel shank provides structure to the boot to make sure that arch doesn't collapse under the weight of your body. And then the combination part to provide a smoothing effect to the stiffness so your foot doesn't feel the end of that rigid steel. Usually this combination material is some form of fiberboard. Bridlen's used leather here, which will break in better than fiberboard over time, just have a little more flex, and certainly last much longer. Keep in mind, guys, the shanks for all these boots extend further into the midfoot than they appear. This happens because the boots are cut at an angle due to their asymmetry, and the sanding process further erodes the shank, leaving only a remnant of it visible. A foam heel pad for comfort, and then a leather sock liner. One of the more solid footbeds I've seen in a dress boot. Moving up, you've got the lining, pretty standard calfskin lining, and then this white interlining material here, which helps bind the upper leather to the lining itself and also provides a little more structure to hold that last shape over time. And then the upper leather, which we'll talk about a bit later. For structure, we've got a Celastic toe stiffener, basically a type of thermal plastic, and then a leatherboard heel counter, which is pretty good. These are usually one of three materials, either Celastic, leatherboard, which is a composite leather material, basically what MDF is to wood, or real full-grain leather. For the toe stiffener, Celastic is fine. Really high-end shoes will use full-grain leather, although some shoemakers actually argue that Celastic is even better than full-grain leather for maintaining its structure. But from my conversations, the consensus is leatherboard is actually the worst for the toe stiffener because it can actually crack and break in a way that leather and plastic can't. The real benefit, I think, of actual skived leather is that you won't have that ridge form as you use the boot where you can delineate where the toe stiffener ends. For the heel counter, however, leatherboard is definitely superior to Celastic, and that is a comfort concern. Probably not the biggest deal in the world, but just going to break in a bit faster, kind of mold to the shape of your heel a bit better over time. Then the goring that the Chelsea boot is of course known for, pretty standard goring here with a rectangular lattice structure, and the pull tab, also standard. It's kind of a nylon polyester. Pretty good, right? This is solid as far as dress boots go, and you might be looking at this and kind of not really sure what to make of it, but wait until we go over the next boots on this list. By comparison, you'll start to really see what makes this and the other boots distinct in how they're built. The upper leather here comes from Tannery d'Annonay. This is a French tannery known for producing some of the highest quality leathers in the world. I personally really like Annonay leather. I love their black especially. There's a couple pictures I always show of TLB Mallorca, who also uses Annonay leather. To me, they perfectly illustrate the cleanliness and clarity of the leather, the uniformity and evenness of the pore structure. I mean, everything that comes out of Annonay is really just great stuff, and that is exactly what we have here. This model comes in black, dark brown, burgundy, snuff suede, and this one, which is bitter choco. And now, this absolutely nasty brown museum calf. Oh my goodness, just look at the B-roll. Oh, you dirty, dirty girl. I quite like this take on a dark brown. It's actually fairly desaturated, giving it a grayish tone. Fairly unusual in my experience, and part of what I think makes this boot more accessible to more formal, austere use cases like suits. Also a good example of what you're really paying for when you get into these $300, $400, $500 price categories. While the colors are still brown, black, tan, so on, you start to get more subtle variations on these colors that you wouldn't normally see from a cheaper product. This comes in at a fairly standard 3 millimeters in thickness that is divided evenly between the lining and the upper itself. Remember guys, these are dress boots. We're prioritizing flexibility and comfort as soon as possible out of the box. Heritage style boots, which are quite different, often have thicker leathers that are 2, 3, 4 millimeters just for one layer. That's because they're prioritizing protection and durability, not comfort and aesthetic. Make no mistake, a 1 millimeter leather will be able to last you a lifetime, but it's of course not the sort of thing you want to go logging with. And along that dimension, these are quite flexible. Now we'll talk about comfort in a little bit, but as you can imagine, these are fairly breathable, they're fairly flexible. Having that thinner leather comes with a variety of benefits. Moving on to the last of this boot, the last actually refers to the wooden or plastic model upon which the leather is formed. It's the base geometry of the entire footwear. And while the last is actually that model, we also use that term just to refer to the geometric aesthetic of the overall boot. Now this last is very full-bodied. It's very reminiscent of English design in that it has a more standard classic look to it, but also with a little bit of contemporary character. One example being the chiseled toe. Now this is a soft chisel. The harder the chisel on the boot, the more contemporary, the more stylistic the aesthetic is. I love the soft chisel here. The rest of the boot is quite standard, quite classic and robust, but just that small element is really the giveaway that this is more sophisticated than, a generic boot. Then moving up the vamp, really the highlight of this whole boot, an absolutely perfectly smooth curve from the toe all the way up to the top line. I think it just makes this boot look so perfectly in proportion and really illustrates the overall visual target of a Chelsea boot, which is to guide your eye from the top of the boot down and across towards the toe. There's a soft arc pulling in at the waist and then back to the heel, which is probably the weakest part of this last. you want the heel to have a nice rounding to it, really reflect the natural shape of your heel itself, and then gradually taper through a soft curve up the shaft. Here, it's just kind of dumpy. It sort of flattens out a little bit, and more importantly, you can actually see where that heel counter delineates from the rest of the leather, and it just creates sort of a warped angle that is a little unsightly. Overall, I think it's great and a great way to start this video because we're gonna have some very slender, finessed, refined lasts coming up, but this shows you that you can still have a classic, wide, robust aesthetic and a beautiful piece of footwear. Now, a dress boot would not be a dress boot if not for how it looks. Design is a primary consideration, and Chelsea's are a very interesting vehicle to explore design because they're already minimal boots to begin with. But despite being minimal, there can actually still be quite a lot going on, as is the case with Bridlen's boot, which I would consider somewhat maximalist in its design philosophy. So let's take a look at everything going on here. Starting with the bottom, the outsole is finished to a semi-gloss with a light dye to deepen the natural color of the leather. Then this black dye work which runs along the edge of the sole as an accent. And then the brass heel and toenails. I personally think decorative nails are really cool, but they also help with durability on both the heel and the toe, which tend to wear out pretty fast. The gentleman's notch. We'll talk more about the origins of this in a later section, although it did once serve a function. Nowadays, it's primarily decorative, almost a relic of past tradition. And then the beveled sole, which you can see from that insert we talked about earlier. It adds to the geometric complexity of this product as just a three-dimensional sculptural work of art. Then moving up, the welt edge has this bottom and upper ridge, just a little more interesting than a purely flat, smoothed welt. This actually comes from a specific cutting tool called a B2 cutting edge. I really like how the two ridges catch light in their own way. Then the beveled waist, which is where the sole edge goes from square to rounded. This creates a sort of geometric continuity that wraps around the boot, where the roundness of the upper is reflected in the roundness of the beveled waist, which is then reflected in the roundness of the beveled sole. Normally, boots with a beveled waist have it on both sides, but Bridlen's actually opted to only do it on the inside here. Kind of an interesting design choice, not one I've seen before, but I think works here because these are already fairly robust boots to begin with. So there's something like thematic about how the broadness of the outside sole edge reflects like the strength and robustness of a classically designed product, where the inside has that roundness, which is a little more feminine, a little more contemporary, and reflects the contemporary edges that this boot has from a design perspective. So kind of a funny like reflection of the overall balance that exists with the design of this product. Then the welt fudging, these decorative ridges here on the welt edge, they act as a decorative frame to the upper, much like the decorative frame of a painting. And additionally, that edge is beveled, so there's a slight angle on that welt edge, which not only catches light in a very interesting way, but also helps prevent that sole edge from having kind of a brick-like platformed look that you often get when that edge is strictly squared off. Moving back to the heel, there are 3 layers other than the insole and top lift. They are sanded perfectly flush and dyed uniform, and finally complemented by decorative heel wheeling running along the edge. The sole stitch you can see on the welt, which runs through the welt into the outsole. The density of this is something we use to measure craftsmanship because it's harder to get more dense stitching, but it also helps with that visual framing. In the same way a higher frequency of welt fudging looks more refined, a higher density of stitching similarly looks more refined. Around $400, you would expect this sole stitch to have a density of somewhere between 4 and 6. These have 9, which is actually really impressive. Stitch density gets exponentially harder the higher you go up. So while 8 to 9 might not seem like a big difference, that's really distinct, and I don't know of any other boots around this price that have a stitch density that high. And it is uniformly done all throughout. Well, there's a couple issues, but we'll talk about that later. The stitch density of the upper, similarly, you'd expect somewhere between 8 and 12. These land right at 12. Are you tired of hearing about unique, innovative qualities possessed by this boot? The upper stitching goes from double to single where the goring ends, and is the only boot to do so. This is so subtle that I almost missed putting it in the video. Yes, it makes the boot seem lighter and aesthetic, and you can figure that out. But the fact that Afon went out of his way to tinker with the smallest details is so cool to me. And it's actually cool. It's not just because it's on the script. That's actually how I feel. I wrote this, by the way. As someone who loves to have fun and play in the making process, the creative process, I mean, that's how innovation happens, guys. It happens through fun and play. Like, there's no business reason to do this. No one cares. Except for me. But I don't pay for the boots anyways. Like, imagine the extra labor it costs to do this. It's probably not insignificant. But Afon's doing it because he wants to. Because he wants to explore what this product can be. And I'm not just blowing smoke. I mean, you can watch the interview I have with him. It's actually really interesting. And you can really, you can hear the passion in his voice when he talks about shoemaking. I mean, we have an entire discussion just about the nature of fun and play in, the making process. So check that out. The heel stitch binding the rear panels together is done very well. It's very uniform. Sometimes this can be a strip of leather called a backstay. I actually like both equally, but I think there's something kind of impressive about the heel stitch itself because it can't be covered. It's something that really has to be done well if you're going to do it at all. And then the goring shape. Let me tell you guys, we're going to talk a lot about goring design in this video, okay? So we are just getting started with this one. But this is a great one to start with because the goring shape here is very simple and it works very well. It's actually a really important part of the design of a Chelsea boot, something I didn't even realize until I got my hands on all these and started actually looking at it. So you'll see later just how different goring shapes can be. But talking about this one specifically, it's a basic rounded teardrop shape that tapers as it goes up the shaft. This complements the overall aesthetic goal of a Chelsea boot in general, which is to guide your eye down and across from the top line to the toe. It's full-bodied, clean, and simple. There's not a lot to digest visually, but I think that works well because that's reflective of the overall design philosophy of the last itself, which is classic and unpretentious, but also refined. And a common theme you'll see throughout this video when talking about good and bad design is that good design is often composed of reflections of design elements within an overall product. So when you see simplicity on one part of the product, you want to see it on the other. Now, of course, it can be more nuanced. Sometimes you want balance, where two opposing elements balance each other out. But this is tricky and also highly contextual. For something like this, the relationship of the goring to the overall boot is one where you want that mirroring, that reflection. Hey, don't get mad at me if it sounds too good. We'll go over Imperfections, but I told you it's my favorite one, okay? So pretty good as far as design goes. Again, it's a little tricky to just look at a boot in isolation. What we talk about here in all of this section is really going to start to develop color as you guys watch the next sections and really see how different a lot of these boots can be. Because this might seem just like a minimal Chelsea boot, but what you're going to find out later in this video is that this is actually what I would describe as a maximalist Chelsea boot. All right, let's talk about fit, comfort, and style. For all the greatness that these boots have been so far, the question is, are they comfortable? Do they fit well? and how can you actually use them in your everyday life? These come in at 516 grams or 18.2 ounces, right around the middle of the 6 boots on this list. While a couple of these boots are notably light, none of them are heavy enough that you can't wear them for multiple hours at a time or throughout your day, and that includes these. As far as break-in period, how comfortable are they out of the box? In my opinion, break-in comes down to 3 points. The first is the vamp, where it flexes as you walk. This, with stiffer leathers, can dig into your toes and basically crunch down on you. The second is the ankle, where it can kind of feel like your lower calf is in a steel pipe. And the third is the footbed, where it can just feel stiff, almost as if there's a brick taped to your foot. The first two are really the biggest that impact comfort, and thankfully for me, within a couple hours of walking around, I didn't even notice it on these. There's a little bit of stiffness, but not enough that it ever felt like actually painful, which can be the case with some boots. The sole on this one was a bit stiff and did take more than a few hours. Of course, that's due to the thicker footbed in general, but by the end of the week, I wasn't even thinking about it. Ground feel, you're quite elevated off the ground. You have a fairly thick cork footbed. You're just not going to really feel the ground you walk on. For example, if you're walking on paved cobblestone or uneven brick. But more importantly, you will get pretty good shock absorption from that cork. Not a huge deal, but especially if you have knee issues, it's something that can compound over tens, hundreds of thousands of steps. And then these also come with thin leather insoles with heel pads, a little more cushion on the heel. You'll have a little more cushion in the rest of the foot, but mainly those inserts, in my opinion, are there more just to help with fit. For example, I prefer a more snug boot, so often those inserts, even on a well-fitting boot, can make it perfect for me. Breathability, insulation. We do have a couple boots coming up that are super breathable and really the best options for those warm nights out, especially when it's a little humid. These are not those. You're not going to be sweating up a storm in these, right? Thinner uppers, leather versus rubber outsole, they're going to be a bit more breathable in general, but with a thicker footbed comes better insulation from the ground. This is most relevant for winter weather, right, guys? If you have wetness kind of getting into your boots a little bit, the cold from that, you don't want to get into your foot as you're walking around. And then fit and sizing. These come in a double E width. Bridlen's products in general run wider. Mine fit comfortably and felt well proportioned. Most notable is the arch support here, likely from the thick leather and fiddleback insert. I really felt that footbed pressing up against my arch. It felt very snug, like as if the boot was hugging my midfoot from all directions. You might not like that, but I like a snug fit. Fit is hard to talk about because everyone's foot is a little different and everyone also has different preferences for how their products fit. My real recommendation for Bridlen and all these companies is if you have questions about sizing, check out their websites. Some of them have sizing guides, but more importantly, just email them. Any good shoemaker will be happy to help you get the right size.
So Nick, I want to talk to you about what we call 3D attachment, right?
Every other factory that I've been to where they make shoes, they'll cut the leather like we've seen, they'll stitch it together, and then it'll get pulled over the last either by hand or with a machine. But that's not the way you do it at Bridlen, and I haven't seen this done before.
Well, it's going to get attached first on the last, as you can see, and then immediately taking to a sewing machine to sew it down. Now, the reason he's doing it on the last is, on a last, there are different dimensions, what we call a positive dimension and a negative dimension. Positive dimension here, then it kind of dips inside and then comes out again. So it's two different dimensions on the same side. And you see when he's going around the corner of the upper, the dimension changes. But if you were to do this process on a flat surface, you would only get one dimension. But by doing it on a 3D model, we're bringing almost, partial shape to the upper even before the lasting process starts. Leather only has a certain amount of stretch, but then in the lasting process, sometimes we put excessive amount of stretch. We're avoiding that. This also helps to keep the originality of the leather, the touch of the leather, as it was meant to be, intact.
As far as styling goes, how can you use these? What outfits would you wear this with? What sort of occasions would you bring these on? You know, the answer might be a little dissatisfying for me to say something like, well, kind of anything, but that is the answer, and that's also sort of the point of a Chelsea boot, right? The whole point of what makes Chelsea boots so appealing is that they're so versatile. These are no different, but being dress Chelseas, they can also be pushed a little further into the more formal end. And with these, there's really two things helping that out. The leather color being a more grayish, muted brown will prevent attention being drawn away from your top half, which is really what you want when you're wearing a suit. You want people's eyes to naturally gravitate up to your face. But because you have the chiseled toe, when people do notice your Chelseas, they'll be able to tell that they are elevated. These are great for the guy who wants to look good, but not overdress, who wants to have style, but not be weird about it. Perfect boots do exist. And they're not these. If you want perfection, you can get it. For the price of around $3,000, or a 1995 GMC Jimmy SLE on sale. At just shy of $400, these boots are neither perfect nor 2 orders of Parmesan Reggiano nor 2 orders of Parmesan cheese Reggiano Parmesan cheese wheel 80, 2 orders on Parmigiano Reggiano top grade cheese wheel 80-pound Parmigiano Reggiano. On the left boot, the sole edge die work is faded at the toe. It also doesn't connect to the heel on the exterior side. The top lift nails are just kind of messy. There's a loose thread where the goring stitch goes from double to single on the exterior side. There's a double horizontal stitch amid the goring on the exterior. The pull tab stitch is just a little uneven. The toe welt joint on the interior side is messy, and the top lift edge finishing on the side of the heel on the interior is bad. On the right boot, the sole edge die work does not perfectly border the edge. There is a loose thread where the goring stitch goes from double to single on the interior. The overlap of the upper panels at the bottom of the goring on the exterior is off kilter, and there's a finishing defect on the rear of the throat of the exterior. The rear of the top line is a bit warping and bent out. There's a welt stitch snafu on the midsection on the exterior side, and there is a gap in the top lift where the rubber leather connects on the side of the exterior. Then on both boots, there is slight messiness where the sole and top lift connect. There's a loose thread where the leather overlaps at the bottom of the goring on the exterior side. There are lasting rumples around the rear. The heel wheeling fades in and out and is weak all around. The welt edge finish is a bit wonky, and then there are flecks of black dye in numerous spots around the upper. Some of these are a concern of craftsmanship, but are otherwise inconsequential. The sole edge die work, for example, is a real imperfection from an artistry standpoint, but realistically will erode the first time you wear the boot. Otherwise, most of these, while more substantial, are ultimately unsurprising and, in my opinion, acceptable for a $400 boot. But that black dye, yikes. The dots are bothersome, but given how small they are and how good this boot is otherwise, personally, I wouldn't care beyond a day. What I do care about, though, is this big black streak. I actually talked to Zahan from Bridlen about this. Shout out to Zahan, he's the homie, and here's what he had to say. You can use your judgment, guys. To me, this is just a quality control miss. These things happen. I haven't heard any reports of this being a consistent issue with Bridlen by any means. You know, I think the important thing is Bridlen's making a statement here that this is not up to their standard, and it is something they would work to resolve. But ultimately, it doesn't matter what I think. Providing you with the information and documentation you need to form your own opinion regardless of whether or not it aligns with my own is the purpose of these reviews. If you find any or all of these imperfections unacceptable, that is perfectly valid. What I will say, though, is that if that's the case, you're going to have a tough time finding something that you do find acceptable on the market without either making substantial trade-offs or going up in price. If you do want to go up in price, this next boot, an example of truly flawless Goodyear welted construction, might be exactly what you're looking for. Where English shoe design is broad, robust, and almost stoic, Spanish shoe design pushes the purely classic in a more contemporary direction. Slender, pointed lasts featuring swooping curves along the body and sculpted toes. Great for the guy who wants to look sharp and classic, but not boring. TLB Mallorca is one such Spanish shoemaker started over 20 years ago by Toni Llobera Barceló, who learned leatherworking from his father and grandfather. Where Bridlen represents a maximalist creative philosophy, packing as much as they can into their boot, TLB Mallorca's Artista 296 Chelsea boot is the polar opposite. It does very little, but does it perfectly. And there is no better illustration of this than its construction. Now this boot is Goodyear welted, but before we look into the details of it, just take a look at this cross section. Not a single gap, however small, anywhere in the entire footbed. Where Bridlen is an example of a well-made Goodyear welted boot, this truly represents absolutely perfect construction. Do you remember when we talked about the channeled insole when looking at Bridlen? Well, take a look here. Do you see that white rib at the front of the toe? That's the gemming I was talking about. So this is how most Goodyear welted boots are created. Instead of the welt stitch going from the welt through the upper layers through the insole itself, it goes through this canvas rib, which is glued to the insole, forming effectively a wall through which that stitch can be made. Again, there's arguments to be made about which is better for different reasons from a functional standpoint. In my opinion, I don't think it's really going to make a huge difference. Mainly, we're talking about appreciating the craftsmanship and innovation that goes into Bridlen, for example, who figured out how to channel their insole. But there's a couple different things going on here. So let's get started with the outsole. This is a Vibram Eton outsole. This Vibram sole is known for being particularly dense, which makes it extremely durable. However, it's also slightly softer than a standard rubber, which means you'll not only get more grip on the ground, but you'll also have a little bit easier of a break-in period. The double studs actually have a hidden function here. Not only up front do they increase the grip of the boot, but they actually provide flex points to make the sole break in a little bit easier, as it allows a little more flexibility in that forefoot. Funny note on this, if you're anything like me, first of all, I'm so sorry. You should probably see someone. Second of all, you might be wondering, well, this Vibram stuff, is it really that big of a deal? Is it really different from normal rubber? Let me tell you a quick story. When I got these cut in half, which I do at the same machinist using the same equipment, he noted specifically that these were the toughest to cut through. Not the most rigorous test out there, but a nice form of validation that this rubber that presumably you're paying extra for is actually more resilient. Moving up the heel, you've got a full grain leather heel stack. And then the cork, which is packed very tightly. It has a little more rubber content than Bridlen. Bridlen, you can see, is a little bit crumbly on the inside, and it also gives the cork a nice kind of squish to it. Again, you're going to get a lot of shock absorption out of these boots between the rubber outsole and the cork. Another small differentiation between the other Goodyear welted boots on this list is you actually do not have any cork running up into the heel. Instead, it's replaced entirely by this white fiberboard material. Now, this fiberboard is going to be a little bit stiffer. TLB actually told me it's to help prevent the shank from moving around and provide a little more structure to that midsection of the boot. I imagine it will help over time because, again, you remember, guys, cork will displace over time in the same way it kind of molds to your foot. It literally moves around. For me personally, I like the idea that there's not cork in that rear section and that it can't move from that rear to the front, causing like gaps above the heel. On the other hand, you could say, well, I'd rather have cork in the heel because I want that little extra shock absorption. I think just having the rubber outsole probably makes up for that. Something to think about. Also not something I think is really going to matter unless you're someone who has a really specific issues with your knees. And here you can very clearly see that sole stitch at the front running through the outsole and the welt, and then that welt stitch, a little harder to see, but you can just make it out running from the welt through the upper layers through that gemming. Again, it's not going into the insole, it's just going through the gemming. And you can see that both at the front and at the rear. And you can see there's also a staple that helps hold that together. So it makes that connection really, really solid, that even if you have deterioration in the welt stitch, that staple is really going to help hold things together. This boot and Bridlen both are 360-degree welts, which means that welt runs all the way around the entire shoe, connecting with itself at one point, the welt joint. 360-degree welt. Remember that for later. Then we have the full leather insole, pretty standard there. And then above that, the heel pad, which is a nice dense foam. Look at how well stuck down this heel pad is all through the entire length of it. Even on really high-end shoes, it's not abnormal to see a little bit of lift, especially where that primary heel nail drives through the heel block, which again, not a big deal, but it's just kind of a crazy testament to how dialed in TLB Mallorca is on what they do. Moving on, we've got the lining, pretty standard calfskin lining. You've got the interlining again, and then the upper leather, which we'll talk about in a second. The toe stiffener is Celastic here. I believe it's full leather on their dress shoes, or at least used to be I did ask Tony about this. Even Tony himself said that Celastic tends to be better for holding structure, especially important when you have a really kind of narrow chiseled toe like this. And then on the rear, the heel counter is full leather. To reiterate, guys, a leather heel counter will mold to your heel better over time and kind of hold its structure really well. Leatherboard, you'll get that molding, but it'll be a little fragile. Again, if leatherboard bends really hard, it can just break and basically be done. Celastic will have that durability and resilience, but it'll be a little bit uncomfortable, take a bit longer to break in. And then the goring. It's not the standard kind of vertical lattice that you see on Bridlen. It's a little more of like a diamond mesh. It definitely has a tighter weave to it, which is pretty cool. I do personally really like the aesthetic of it having that more diamond pattern, just a little more complex. And then the pull tab, pretty standard. Again, just sort of a nylon polyester. Now, let's talk about the leather. So, this leather is pretty special. This is Vigano leather from Annonay, which is located in the titular Annonay, France. Tannery Annonay is most distinguished by the cleanliness of its calfskin leather. I'll show their black box calf on a pair of TLB Oxfords. The visual clarity, the consistency of pore structure, it looks like a precious stone or something. It's really quite beautiful. It is not vegan leather. It is Vigano. It's an Annonay specific term, but basically refers to leather that they've not fully finished. And that's why Vigano leather tends to have more lighter colors, such as this kind of medium light brown. Because it doesn't go through the same drum dyeing process that full aniline leather goes through, a process that stiffens the leather, Vigano tends to be a bit softer and easier to break in. This clocks in right about 2.5 millimeters of thickness, actually the thinnest on this list. Most boots run slightly over 3. Remember guys, with dress boots, we want thinner leathers. We want thin, dense leathers that are lightweight, breathable, and easy to break in, but still maintain their overall structure and durability. This is the light brown. It also comes in dark brown and black. I was really tempted to do the dark brown, but we've already got a lot of dark brown here. So I went with the light brown, and I'm glad I did, because this light brown really, I think, shows what makes colors at higher price points special. It's not just a flat light brown. It actually has this very subtle black dotting all over the boot that is almost imperceptible until you really look into it, but it adds like a really nice subtle texture and dimension to the color that makes it something a little more than just a light brown. Some people like to talk about creasing when it comes to leather, how it creases as you use it. I personally have never really thought about that. I've never seen a shoe or boot that creases in a way that made me feel a particular way. They all just kind of look pretty similar to me. You know, insofar as I'll make any comment on creasing, which this will probably be the only boot I'll make any comment on, nothing here creases in a way that I myself had anything really to say about. Now this is TLB Mallorca's Picasso last. So most of their lasts are the same through the body except for the toe specifically. The Picasso last features a pointed chiseled toe. You can see, unlike Bridlen, it is a little more sculpted. It has a little more of a swooping asymmetrical curve, which matches the natural asymmetry of your foot. The interior arc is a little bit sharper and gives that really shapely pulling in at the midsection. Much better heel here, a straight line coming down the shaft and then rounds out at the bottom. It is simply well executed to begin with. You can't see the heel counter delineated from the rest of the leather. There's no kind of rumples or disfiguration. And keep in mind, guys, for those of you wondering, oh my gosh, that looks so uncomfortable. It's so slender at the toe, it'll squeeze my foot. Your foot does not actually come to the very end of the shoe, right? Your toe actually stops short of the very front. So your foot will still have a perfect fit because the boot is elongated in order to have that sculptural quality. Overall, I think it's a great last. Probably the only thing that irks me a little bit is just how flat it is on this midsection coming down the vamp. Again, because it doesn't have that more full-bodied toe like Bridlen, it's not going to be a perfect curve down to the toe, but I would like to see just a little more smoothness in that curve. But now let's move on to the design elements. This is a minimal boot. I mentioned it before, and now you guys are going to see why. Starting off with the sole, I do want to make note of just how beautiful I personally find the color and texture. It's a very sort of rich black, where typically rubber is more of a neutral gray. And then on the edge here, there's just a slight bevel done so that it doesn't meet a sharp 90-degree angle on the bottom corner. Very, very small detail and arguably completely unnecessary, but something that I think really makes this aesthetic. And I'll give you a preview of one of our other soles that has no bevel on that edge. It just has a bit more chunk to it. It's kind of fascinating how significant of an effect just a very, very slight bevel can have. And, you know, TLB Mallorca is the kind of company you would expect to have that sort of detail. Then moving up the side, you've got the sole edge. It is, again, dyed perfectly uniform and sanded flush to the rubber. Of course, you're always going to be able to see that rubber compared to the leather, but this is about as good as you would reasonably expect it. You also do have a nice bevel on the waist, both on the interior and the exterior. These small details are always nice to have, but are especially important when you have a rubber sole, because rubber soles are inherently a little thicker than leather soles. They tend to give a really kind of aesthetic chunkiness that small details like this help balance. One unique feature of this boot that differs from all others on this list is the complete absence of any welt fudging. This welt has no sort of ridge on it. It's perfectly flat and just has a slight beveled to it. Now, typically welt fudging is something that you would expect on a product of this price, and TLB Mallorca does have it on most of its footwear, but it's clearly a distinct design choice here that I think works because of the overall minimal aesthetic of the Chelsea boot to begin with. And part of why I think it works is having that bevel, which just makes it look less chunky. It really gives a bit of lift and lightness, and also another kind of angle for light to bounce off of on that edge. Moving back to the heel, you've got 1, 2, 3 layers. They are perfectly uniform, even, straight, sanded flush, and dyed evenly. Hey, buddy. Hi. Hello. He wants to be a star, huh? Oh, you like the butt scratches. That's it. Oh my gosh. Go. Okay. There's no heel wheeling here. That's pretty standard. You're not going to see that on a rubber sole. That can only be done on leather. And then that sole stitch, which you can see on the welt. Even in the absence of welt fudging, it acts as a pretty good decorative touch on its own. 6 stitches per inch and uniform all around. Similarly, the stitching on the upper comes in at a strong 13 to 14 stitches per inch, also uniform all around, both in the stitching in itself and in the spacing between the lines. And then the heel stitch. Here we have a back stay or back strip. It's very uniform, very clean and even, very straight up and down. And now, of course, my favorite thing, the goring shape. Similar to Bridlen, fairly simple, minimal design with a couple differences. One is that the bottom, instead of being a teardrop shape, is a little more rectangular, a little more angled off on the corners. This broader base not only grounds the boot a little bit more, but it also reflects the pointed angle at the toe. Again, very subtle, guys, but what we like to see in good design are sort of reflections of the overall design philosophy found in different elements of the overall product. And then the top line edge, look how cleanly it's finished. You're always going to have a little bit of roughness from that lining being cut off, but this has among the cleanest top line finishing of all the boots. What TLB is really doing here is they're emphasizing having a classic design with a little bit of stylish flair. It's not doing much. It's not trying to give you something extravagant, but it's trying to do exactly what it does perfectly. And I think they've, by and large, accomplished that. Now that we've talked about how this boot looks and what it is, let's talk about how it fits, is it comfortable, and what can you wear it with? What's the style? Is it styling? All that good stuff. This comes in at 481 grams or 17.0 ounces. A little bit heavier on this list, but that's to be expected with a rubber sole. Really nothing notable on this one. It had a little bit of break-in, a little bit of stiffness at first, especially rubber soles are always going to be a little bit stiffer. Although I think the flexibility of the Vibram is really shining here because for me, after a few hours of wearing this around, I wasn't really even thinking about it. Pretty good ground feel on these. I personally tend to have a little more ground feel with rubber, and I think part of that is just because rubber in general will bend and flex more across multiple dimensions than a standard leather. Breathability, insulation, no real notes here. Again, rubber soles always going to be more insulated, especially if you're looking for like a luxury boot that you need to still wear out in rough weather, maybe in Manhattan or something, and you still wear these in the winter. These are going to be about as waterproof as you can get. The fit is pretty good. I felt it pretty proportional. Again, fairly standard, not something I felt was too different from Bridlen. Check out the fitting guide on their website. If you, like me, prefer a snug fit and are also American, let them know that preference. Americans tend to provide wider fits, so many international shoemakers will err towards that if you're in between sizes and don't specify with them. The base ready-to-wear model, priced at $545, comes in a standard F width, though if you want something different, their customizable made-to-order model is $650, but includes all possible options like leather soles, medallions, alternative leathers, etc. But otherwise, I know some of their other Chelseas come in lasts that can be variable with. As far as formality, color, given the pointed toe, the fact that this is clearly not just your average Thursday run-of-the-mill Chelsea boot, it's clearly a very intentional dress footwear product. I think this is really a boot that can go well with a suit. I think a lot of these boots can kind of go with a suit, but now we're talking about something that's sort of almost meant for a suit. And I know there's people who are going to say, oh, I'll never wear a Chelsea boot with a suit. It's like, it's 2025, at least in America. That's something that's probably acceptable, especially if you're talking about inclement weather. The nice thing about Chelseas is that they're kind of versatile no matter what color you're using. You can still wear it for a night out. You can still dress it down as much as you want. Oh. All right, let's do imperfections. Starting with the left boot, the sole is slightly off center. You can see that on the buttons where they're just shifted a little bit off to the side. The welt joint is messy on the interior. Typically, you want to see that perfectly flush and clean, basically as invisible as you can get it. Here's a preview of an example we'll see later. The top edge of the welt around the heel is a bit messy. There's an inserted bit of leather underneath the welt on the heel exterior. I don't actually know what that's for. It may not be an imperfection, but I thought I'd point it out because I don't typically see it. There's a scuff on the vamp on the interior, and the goring stitch is a bit messy at the bottom on the interior. Now on the right boot, the welt joint is slightly not flush on the interior. There's a black dot on the midsection side of the exterior. And then on both boots, the sole edge waist bevel on that midsection is just a bit rough. The rubber is a little bit excusable, but the welt itself is also rough, which that could be smooth. Ideally, both of them would be smooth. There's a loose thread inside the goring on the exterior side. The leather edge where it meets the goring changes like 3/4 the way up. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but I don't really like it as a design choice if it is. I'd prefer that edge either be consistent all throughout or change right where the goring ends. And then on the interior, there's just kind of what seems like a lasting rumple. It's just a specific bowing out at the bottom of the goring. And then there are minor wrinkles scattered around. I don't know if I should really even include those, but, you know, I'm throwing them in. And that's it. Much smaller of a list than Bridlen, right? And really, I think an emphasis on the fact that, you know, Bridlen has a lot of imperfections, but that's also because Bridlen's like doing a lot with their boot, where TLB is far more focused in their execution and $150 more. Just how much money, or rather how little, can you spend while still getting a properly made dress boot? These next two boots give us the answer, but along very different dimensions. One is for winter weather, rugged use, and hardy textured outfits. The other is for handsome casual outfits and warm nights out. And I want to show you that one first, because not only is it the lowest price on this list, but it's also the one I would wear if I wanted light, comfortable, and stylish. This is the Bolton Chelsea boot by Beckett Simonon, an American company that manufactures in Colombia. It's normally $269, but with this 15% off code, that drops to just $228. With black Italian leather and a slim, contemporary last, these boots look great, but that's not why I'm showing them to you. If you're tired of stiff, heavy boots, these are the most lightweight, breathable, and comfortable ones I found on the market. But how exactly? Well, it comes down to construction. See this thin, lightweight, flexible footbed? That's made possible by Blake stitch construction. Instead of being composed by two primary stitches that create a void in the middle of the shoe, increasing the size of the footbed, Blake stitch is made with just one stitch that runs from the outsole through all the layers into the insole. This comes with benefits and drawbacks. The benefits, of course, are allowing for a thin, light footbed that's very flexible and comfortable out of the box, as well as being more breathable and appropriate for warmer weather. It's also cheaper to do, which is why Blake stitch shoes and boots tend to be far less expensive than their Goodyear welted counterparts. The breathability or lack of insulation can be a downside if you're working with colder weather, but the big drawback here is that these are not watertight. Because that stitch runs from the outsole all the way to the insole, water from a small puddle or even just wet concrete will wick up through that thread and get into your socks. It won't ruin the boot, and it's not ultimately the end of the world, but you'll have wet socks. Blake boots are also harder and therefore more expensive to resole, typically landing around $150 to $200. Personally, I don't think it's that big of a deal because at this price, you may as well just buy a new boot anyways. But with construction explained, let's dive into the materials. These have a vegetable tan leather outsole, a studded rubber top lift, and a full leather heel stack, which is pretty impressive at this price where you'd normally expect something like leatherboard. Moving up, there's a thin black strip of leather, likely there just to add a little bit of height, a little more arch support, and then a combination steel fiberboard shank. It's nice to have the structure of that steel. At this price, guys, I personally would expect just fiberboard or maybe even plastic. Then we have the insole. It is a very thin insole board made of salpa, which is a type of leather board that's bound using natural latex, a foam heel pad, and a full sock liner. The full sock liner is pretty important here. It provides an extra protective barrier over that stitch for any water that might wick in. Typically, companies that do half sock liners are doing it to show off that they have a full real leather insole. Of course, that's not the case here. Overall, the footbed looks great. The materials are pretty good for the price. Obviously, they're not amazing materials. It's also not $1,000. Mainly, the construction is very tight. There's no gaps anywhere. Again, nowhere you can get really significant friction that could start tearing away at these materials over time. And while some people might dislike the thinness of the footbed or the thinness of the insole, for me, I think those are, number one, just necessities for the cost of the boot. But more importantly, they're kind of features, right? Beckett Simonon sort of leaning in to the fact that they have a light, flexible, comfortable boot. Then we have a Vachetta lining. Vachetta is a specialty leather that's known for being very buttery soft and smooth. It's tanned using a specific fat liquoring process. I wouldn't call this a true Vachetta. I talked more about this in my full review of Beckett Simonon. This is more of what I'd call a functional Vachetta, where it's made using a dual tanning method that isn't quite true Vachetta, but it does still result in that buttery, supple softness. There's a little leftover piece of material stuck in at the toe, but otherwise pretty clean. A white interlining and then the black leather upper. As for the stiffeners, the toe is Celastic and so is the heel. Both about what you'd expect at this price, and frankly, it's just nice to have actual stiffeners there, because it wouldn't surprise me if some products around this price don't have any. Pretty standard goring, a rectangular lattice structure, and a standard polyester pull tab. Onto the leather, this comes from Gruppo Mastrato. It's an Italian tannery group. It's nothing really special. We've talked about high-end tanneries. Gruppo Mastrato is really just a large tannery group that I would consider mid-grade. For me, I think it's just worth pointing out that they actually are transparent about where their leather comes from, even though it's not the highest end tannery, which is fine. It's a $200 boot. It's not going to be the highest end leather. I don't want to get tangential because I know some people don't really care about this, but Beckett Simonon does have a lot of really nice like transparency stuff on their website about where their boots are made, how the factory workers are treated, so on and so forth. It's not a huge thing. I don't think it's necessary at all, but that's also why I think it's worth pointing out. You know, I'm really not the social responsibility guy, but I can appreciate it when I see it, and I think it's worth celebrating, especially because it's one of these things that most people won't even take the time to read all this material on their website that they have about it, but I want to recognize it.
Ya llevo aproximadamente unos 32 años trabajando calzado. Trabajé 17 años en una empresa, luego de ahí ya la empresa se acabó, entonces ya busqué otro rumbo. Pues tuve la opción, la oportunidad de entrar acá, que ha sido una bendición para mí muy grande, trabajar en esta empresa, y ya voy a cumplir 2 años acá. Entonces al pasarlo por acá, por este cepillo, luego de pasarlo a este, realza más el brillo, ¿sí? Hace que realce más el brillo. Entonces a veces cuando uno ya termina el zapato y está listo para llevar a la caja, dice, vea qué zapato tan bonito, vea lo que hacemos acá, vea, como que uno mismo, sí, como que dice, vea lo que yo hago, ¿cierto? Por decirlo así, ¿no?
So this comes in black. It also comes in Bordeaux, oak, and tan. I really like this black. I think it's rich. I think it has a nice wax finish. The B-roll kind of speaks for itself. It's not perfect and definitely doesn't have the visual clarity or consistency of Annonay leather, for example, but it doesn't strike me as cheap by any means. Just a competent mid-grade leather. Now, black Chelseas are, I think, a little less versatile than dark brown, but I did choose black in this specific model for a particular reason, but we are going to go over that in the styling section. Standard thickness here, about 3 millimeters, split evenly between the upper and the lining, and very flexible. Again, very supple right out of the box. Now let's move on to the last. I consider this really like the most basic, fundamental version of a proper dress boot last. There's nothing really extreme or particularly sophisticated going on here, but it's a really great, basic, well-made framework of an aesthetic boot. It's more slim and slender overall. It has a nice arc on the interior of the waist. It has an almond toe, which effectively is round, but with more taper. Bridlen had that soft chisel, which added a little bit of contemporary stylistic flair to what was otherwise a classic boot. The almond toe pushes that further, where it's even more classic being rounded, but the pointed taper still gives it a dressy aesthetic. While not a chiseled toe, there is a downward chisel on the top side. This provides an additional face off which light can reflect, but more importantly helps mitigate the bulbous clown shoe aesthetic that often precipitates from fully rounded off toe boxes. I think this image comparison best illustrates the two ends of the aesthetic spectrum. Both are sophisticated, elegant designs, though Bridlen is more robust, earthen, and sculpted, where Beckett Simonon is more fluid, curvaceous, and sexy. We'll talk more about style later, but think about what kinds of outfits and occasions you would wear each boot in. The heel is definitely a highlight here. Beckett Simonon has always had more sculpted, rounded heels. You have a really nice rounding at the base, and then that tapers in nicely as you go up the shaft to the top line. It's also lasted very well. You can't see where the heel counter ends. It smoothly transitions into the rest of the last. I do have a critique of this, and I think that it could be a little more full-bodied, especially around that midsection and on the vamp. I think it swoops down a little too harshly to the point where it makes the boot kind of look more elongated, and that actually sort of feeds into that clown shoe aesthetic that I talked about. That downward chisel on the toe does help mitigate it to some extent, but I do think the fact that it slopes down so harshly makes it look longer than it really should be, even though it is as long as it should be. Overall, I do think it's a more contemporary leaning last, but in a way that isn't too overt and still feels comfortable in a casual environment. But let's see what design can look like at the cheapest possible price. The sole has minimal finishing, just a light burnishing to a matte finish with no dye. There is this stamp, which I do think is quite nice and has been impressed to an even depth. And then we have the studded rubber on the top lift. Quick note on this, I actually really appreciate that it's been studded for that extra grip. While combination top lifts are still good and give you the traction of rubber, because it's flat rubber and it's only a small portion, it can still get a little dusty and lose some traction, especially if you're really moving around, doing something like dancing, for example. I like country swing. I'll even go dancing at the club hip hop or commercial pop in Chelsea's. And having a little extra grip really helps, especially if you're doing like a partner dip, for example. You really want that extra grip, not the time you want to be sliding around. The heel nails, very nice, decorative touch, but also just make it last a bit longer. There is a small notch here. This is actually intentional. This is called the gentleman's notch. It's kind of a throwback to older times when men wore longer trousers that were often kind of baggy. It was easy for them to catch on that interior corner of your shoe. And so this notch was cut, called the gentleman's notch, to help prevent that catching. Less necessary today, and personally from an aesthetic standpoint, I prefer not to have a gentleman's notch, but objectively it is a sign of craftsmanship, and more importantly, it is well executed. Moving up to the sole edge, it is again sanded perfectly flush with no overlap from that welt and dyed uniform. The Bolton does sport a beveled waist on both sides. This might just be me, but I think it really contributes here in a way that is more profound than many of the other boots, specifically because of the lower profile of the upper. That sole edge just becomes a little more noticeable, and light dances on that bevel in a way that I think really pulls together the whole aesthetic. The heel block is cut narrow to the upper, sanded flush, dyed evenly, and burnished to a soft semi-gloss. And despite being on the lowest priced boot here, the heel wheeling has the best execution in terms of depth and consistency. The welt fudging here is not the strongest in my opinion. I think it's okay. It's a very simple, basic pattern. I think the bigger thing is there's no bevel on that corner. You can really tell the difference here, where it just makes that edge look kind of flat and, again, almost brick-like too rectangular. I do think it works, and it's better than it not having welt fudging. I think the bigger thing is that it's all done evenly throughout and uniform in its density and frequency. And then the sole stitch density on that welt is 4.5 stitches per inch. And that stitching is done very uniform and looks good. Now you're probably wondering, what do you mean welt? This is a Blake Stitch shoe. There is no welt. It's not Goodyear welted or hand welted. There's no welt on a Blake Stitch shoe. Well, this, my friends, is a fake welt. And that stitching is also fake. It's real thread, but it doesn't do anything. Now this could just be for decorative touch, and that would still be nice, but actually this fake welt serves two important purposes. Number one, it still serves the function of a normal welt, acting as a wedge that seals the joint between the upper and outsole. Of course, these boots are not watertight because you have the Blake thread that runs through them, but it's just a nice additional layer of protection, preventing your feet from being totally inundated if you step through a puddle. The second benefit is the fake welt acts as an alignment frame for the shoemaker when attaching the upper to the outsole. The upper stitching is 12 stitches per inch, which is actually really good for this price, and is uniform mostly throughout, but we'll talk about that later. Here's some more B-roll of it. I'm sick right now, so I sound kind of nasally. I hope you like the sound of my voice. I'm just recording this to make time to show you more B-roll. Okay, let's move on. The backstay here is, I actually think, one of the strongest features of design, and a fairly unique one. The shaft of this boot does not actually taper much from the heel compared to any other boot, but this backstay itself does narrow as it goes up and then widen back at the top. I really like the illusion that this creates, that the entire shaft itself narrows. I think it gives you this almost S-curve aesthetic that draws the eye from the top down to the bottom of the boot. And then the goring shape. This goring has a squared off bottom that tapers strongly going up to the top. It is fitting, I think. There's a little bit of contemporary edge from those angled corners and that tapering upwards, but it's not too much. The one critique I have of this goring is I do think it might be either too wide or too forward set. Part of the reason this boot looks disproportional, the way it looks almost too long, this front part of the leather on the shaft is too narrow. It should be wider and come back a few centimeters. I think it looks almost dainty, and it just looks wrong, but just barely. It's very, very subtle. But let's do fit, comfort, and style. It's time, right? So these are the second lightest boots, coming in at 441 grams or 15.6 ounces. Break-in period, again, guys, there's basically literally no break-in period with these. I mean, they will get more comfortable over time. You'll probably have a little bit of stiffness in the sole for literally like less than 10 minutes when you walk in them. But one of Beckett Simonon's strongest features is that the leather they use, even if it's not the best leather in the world, is very soft. It's very supple. Pretty strong ground feel here, right? That thin footbed is really going to give you high contact with the ground. So anything you're walking on, if it's, for example, paved cobblestone, something with a little more unevenness, you're going to feel that with these. It's not something that's going to be a big factor for me in buying a piece of footwear, but I like feeling connected to the ground. I like thin soles, but it's not going to have that kind of shock absorption that you get with cork. And the fit on these is pretty snug. They come in a standard D width. I don't think you're going to have the room to put in a big foamy, cushiony insole unless you want to size up. They do come with thin foam insoles though that you can use again to help make your fit a little more snug if you need, or give you just a little more cushion. Breathability and insulation, one of the big features with this one. These are breathable. They're light. It's probably not going to be great in cold weather, certainly if it's wet outside too. But warm nights out, summer days, summer nights, these are a great option for that. And that's a great segue into style. How would you wear these? I talked about how I chose black in these very specifically. I did that because I think these boots are really something you're going to wear with more fresh, cool, hip outfits, right? For a night out. Maybe you're going to the club. Maybe you're just going to the bars. Maybe you're hanging out with people after work. It's a little more chill. It's a little more cool, kind of younger vibes, right? Looks great in jeans. It looks great in chinos. And it's just got a little more contemporary edge. It's just a little more cool than a brown, where a brown's like a little more mature. It's a little more kind of boring for that kind of setting. You know, some people like to have their floral button-ups. You know, they like to dress up when they go out. This is perfect for that. But they're not perfect, so let's go over the imperfections. Left boot. The sole stitch is a bit messy at the welt joint, and there is an overlap on the panels on the exterior. And that's it. Then on the right boot, there's a little bit of pitting on the vamp on the leather. It's very subtle. I mean, I can only barely catch this on camera if I hit it with the light in the right way, but my rule is if I can catch it on camera, I'll show it on tape. There's a scratch on the vamp on the interior and a minor wrinkle up the vamp on the interior side. Then on both boots, the sole finish is just imperfect. There's a little dye marks, some scratches, things of that nature. The rear is just a little bit wonky, not quite straight up and down. There's some wrinkles on the rear. The heel wheeling fades a little bit at the ends. The pull tab is attached at kind of an off angle at the top line. The upper stitching around the goring, it just gets a little bit uneven, a little bit tight on both the interior and exterior side around the corners. And that's it. It's the warm night out Chelsea. It's light, it's breathable, it's a little sexy, you know, go out. So if you live in Florida, you're good, but for everyone else with seasonal cold, rain, and snow, you need a Chelsea boot that can take a beating. See this suede? It's made by British people. We'll talk about it later. See this sole? It's thick. We'll talk about it sooner. This is the 101050 in brown suede. It's from Meermin, a Spanish company that manufactures in Shanghai. Meermin has been around for a long time with stores in Manhattan, Paris, and Madrid. They've already been reviewed by plenty of creators, but most of those reviews are 5 to 6 years old. The question that I've had is, are they as good as they used to be, or did they cash in, get comfortable, and lose their edge? The answer lies in the construction. And that's because construction truly exposes the intention of the maker. In the parts of a boot a customer will never see and might not even care about, do they cheap out? Well, let's find out. Now, these are Goodyear welted, most similar to TLB Mallorca with that white canvas gemming. However, a key difference is these have a 270-degree welt as opposed to a 360-degree welt, which means instead of wrapping entirely around the boot and connecting with itself, the welt only wraps from the beginning of the heel 270 degrees around the boot and ending at the beginning of the heel on the opposite side. I asked Meermin what their philosophy was behind this choice, and here is what they had to say. I actually thought it was going to be a cost reduction thing, but turns out it's actually kind of the opposite. The 270-degree welt allows for a narrower cut on the heel block. In general, guys, you want the heel block to be narrower than the heel itself. A heel block that extends out results in a sort of platform to look that makes the boot look heavy and blocky. You can see the cross-section at the toe is a little bit messier compared to TLB Mallorca with a bit of a gap. And then at the rear, a big difference is now instead of having essentially the identical construction as at the toe, because there's no welt, there's an inserted piece of leather called the heel rand, primarily held in place through nails, staples, and adhesive. It does mean the rear of the boot is technically a little less held together than the rest of it. I've never heard of people having issues with Meermin's heels detaching or this part coming loose, though I do think it would make this rear part of the boot a little less watertight. Probably only relevant if you're walking around in a level of water that you shouldn't for this kind of boot, but something to keep in mind. Starting from the bottom, we've got a full rubber outsole similar to TLB Mallorca, a double studded outsole. However, this is not a Vibram sole. This is just a standard rubber sole, and you can already see the difference. It just has a little less flex to it. It is a bit thicker than that Vibram sole. Then you've got a full rubber top lift, a full leather heel stack, and then, very interestingly, the only boot on this list to have any form of midsole, this one being full leather. I was actually curious about what the purpose of a leather midsole is in the eyes of a boot maker, so I emailed Meermin, and this is what they had to say. I think it is cool seeing how the bootmaker thinks about construction and design and how each component contributes to it. I can also imagine if you're really wearing through this, having the leather midsole there will be kind of an early warning system where if you wear through that rubber, you're not immediately going to tear into that cork. You'll at least see the leather midsole, and then you'll be able to know, okay, it's time to resole the boot, but you'll still have a few hours of wear before the boot's inoperable. Moving up again, you can see that heel rand and then the cork layer. As you would expect, the cork here does go down a little bit in quality as we're going down in price. At the top, we had TLB Mallorca, tightly packed with a great blend of rubber to prevent any sort of uneven crumbling. Then you had Bridlen, tightly packed but not as much rubber, maybe a little bit of risk of crumbling or uneven displacement. And here we have Meermin, where it's still satisfactory, but you definitely have a smaller grit on this cork, a little more gaps within the footbed overall. And then up again, we've got the steel shank. Now, this is unique, being one of only a couple boots on this list with a solo steel shank. Most boots have a combination of steel and leather, steel and fiberboard. And the nice thing about that combo is that the steel shank, which naturally has 3 dimensions to it and has a gap underneath, is that gap won't affect the boot because there's no friction. There's nothing rubbing against each other because that's stuck in place between the shank and its combination part. However, here, because it's not a combination shank, that gap is directly over the cork itself. I haven't heard reports of this being an issue, though it is a criticism I have. Ironically, I would actually much rather have a combination shank to mitigate this problem than I would a leather midsole. But that's just my personal preference. Then a full vegetable tan leather insole, a fairly thin foam heel pad, and then a leather sock liner. The lining is nice, fairly standard, clean calfskin. It is well sealed to the upper of the boot. Then moving to the internals, we have a Celastic toe stiffener, a Celastic heel counter, and that standard interlining between the lining and upper. Celastic heel counter, again, not ideal, but pretty much what you'd expect at this price. Honestly, it's nice just to have any form of heel counter for around $200. This is cut a little bit unevenly. You can see just at the rear that heel counter thins out a bit. It's hard to tell if that's an intentional design decision or just an accident. I'm leaning towards the latter, though something in me kind of says that that could maybe function as a nice flex point that'll help mitigate the inherent stiffness. But then lastly, we have the Goring, a pretty standard rectangular lattice structure, and 2 pull tabs on this boot. And yes, I do have strong opinions about this Goring, in case you were wondering. But we're going to go over that in the design section. Are you hooked? Does that hook you? I need to increase the retention. Pretty solid. I have my criticisms, right? That's what I'm here to point out. But at the end of the day, it's important to kind of grasp the big picture with these things. For $260, this is pretty darn good. And I think, again, fills the role of a boot that still looks good. It still qualifies as a dress boot, at least in my book, but it is one that's going to be a little hardier, a little more durable for inclement weather, and better for more textured, full cold weather outfits. But we'll talk about style, comfort, all that a little bit later. Then we have the leather. Now, it is made by, you know them, you love them, British people. It's not. I don't know why. It's not made by British people. I don't know why. It's from an earlier version of the script where I got the tannery wrong at first. It's from Sciarrata. It's an Italian tannery. I mean, there could be British people there. I don't know. I'm assuming it's probably mostly Italians at the Italian tannery. Is that racist? It's definitely not racist, but I feel like that's fine to assume an Italian tannery has mostly Italian. You know, it's fine. I could talk a lot about it, but really the B-roll, I think, sort of speaks for itself. It has a really nice nap to it. It's not too almost hairy, but it's not too sanded down like kind of a cheaper suede. You can still get that texture when you move your thumb over it and change the direction. This model does come in brown and black full grain leather. I don't think that's a bad choice, but again, I think a boot like this that's built to be a little more durable, I think suede is perfect. It comes in right around that standard 3 millimeters of thickness, divided evenly between the upper and the lining. This is very supple and very flexible. I assume they've probably sanded down the other side to reduce the thinness a little bit and reduce the stiffness, which does help with comfort, especially in that vamp section where with boots it tends to dig into your toes as it flexes. Now on to that last, this is the Hero. It's a more classic last in my opinion. The toe lacks any form of chisel. It's just a pretty standard round almond toe. The heel, while well shaped and smooth as it transitions up the shaft, does lack any distinct stylistic curvature. It does have some fullness in that midsection, and the curve coming down the vamp does kind of rumple a little bit at the forefoot. You know, it's sort of difficult to judge a last when it's in suede because really the minutia that makes a really nice last nice is often found in the way light curves, arcs, and dances around it, which you can really only see on a smooth full grain leather. So again, I think it's a well-made last. I think it's a little on the slimmer side, which is part of why I would still consider it a dress boot, but it's got a little more body than, say, Beckett Simonon, and also a little less character. It strikes me as a little more sort of generic leaning, but all those qualities are why I chose it in suede. I think it really is a last that's asking to be used for a more rugged boot with a fuller silhouette and a thicker rubber outsole. I think in general, you kind of want either a stylized last or a suede leather, because I think that a suede leather and a last that's too stylized, too dressy can kind of compete with each other. All right, so let's go over the design elements. Starting off with the sole edge, it is sanded perfectly flush all around. It's not sanded to a glossy finish. It has more of a sanded, almost wooden finish to it. There's no beveled waist. It is squared off on both sides. And for the welt fudging, they've gone with this tighter pattern. It is fairly consistent all around. What I do appreciate here is the bevel on that top corner of the welt. Bevels add a sense of lightness to any squared off geometry. It's always nice to have, but I think is especially important on more aesthetically heavy boots. And then the heel layers, there are only 2 layers here aside from the insole and top lift. They are sanded perfectly flush, though there is a little bit of waviness going on there. Under $300, you'd expect a stitch density of 4 to 6 for that sole stitch located on the welt. these are 6, and it is actually done very uniform all around. And then the upper stitch density is 12. Fairly uniform all around, not much more to say about it, though I'm doing this voiceover because I want to show you some more B-roll of it, and therefore need to create time with my dumb voice. As for the heel stitch, the stitching itself is executed well as it goes up the rear. No heel wheeling, again, you're not going to see that with a rubber outsole. And the pull tabs. Now, I myself am not crazy about dual pull tabs. I think a single pull tab's enough. That's just my personal preference. I do really like this decorative stitch at the front though, which serves to bind the pull tab in place. If you don't want pull tabs at all, the way I've gotten rid of pull tabs before is to take a really sharp, really thin knife and just cut across right at the base of the pull tab, and that'll remove it perfectly. And you'll have some stray fibers that I've found I can just pull out and it'll be fine. But make sure to use a knife, because if you try to use scissors, the scissors are too thick. They'll leave like a couple millimeters of a stub there. All right, now we're talking about the goring. This is the big one. I know we've all been waiting. I've been keeping you all so patiently to talk about the big reveal here. I actually think the goring kind of destroys the entire aesthetic of this boot. Now, what you'll notice is this is the only boot where the goring actually reverse tapers. It widens as it goes up the side of the boot. And I think that's part of why this boot just has this weirdly blocky, squarish, unbalanced aesthetic to it. You want your eye, you want the visual flow of the product to really go from top to bottom and then also across towards the toe. You want it to flow down the vamp, and you want your goring to echo that overall geometry of narrowing at the top and widening as it goes down. But now you have this kind of upward widening, this upward movement that's fighting the rest of the boot, and I think just creates this sort of unsettling unbalance where you don't feel like your eye naturally sinks to the bottom. It's kind of moving up and down at the same time. To be fair, part of this might be due to the fact that the heel is sort of lifted up at an angle. But I think if you put just a standard tapered goring on this, like Bridlen's goring, suddenly you have quite literally a perfect sub $300 boot. Part of that is because of the last design element we're going to talk about, which is another unique quality that only Meermin's boot possesses on this list, which is a hole cut upper. You may have noticed there's no seam here at the bottom of the goring connecting the panels of the boot, and that's because this boot is made of one panel. It's hole cut, one cut of leather, which might not seem like that big a deal, but at this price, it's kind of crazy to have a hole cut boot. I mean, that's really hard to do. Having a hole cut upper pushes that minimal aesthetic and gives just a little bit more lightness to the overall shape. Now, personally, I don't care a whole lot for a hole cut upper. I actually quite like that stitch going down, especially when it's done at a very stylistic angle. But objectively, it is really impressive from a craftsmanship standpoint. Fit, comfort, and style. These come in at 580 grams or 20.5 ounces. They are among the heavier on this list. Not something I noticed, but again, probably not the kind of boot you want to wear for 6, 8, 10 hours at a time. As for break-in, I had no issue at all on the ankle or the toes. However, I definitely felt it in the sole. It was categorically stiffer than all the others, not to an extent that I felt like it was uncomfortable or unpleasant to wear, but not something that cured itself within a few hours of walking around. So I would expect to wear this boot for maybe a week or two before that sole really starts to flex to its maximum potential. Ground feel, breathability, insulation, these are, of course, quite lifted off the ground. You're going to get a bit of height from these. You're going to get quite a bit of separation. The rubber sole being a bit stiffer than, for example, the Vibram means you're not quite going to get as good of a feel for uneven ground like paved cobblestone or gravel or anything like that. Between the rubber outsole, the leather midsole, and a little more air in that footbed, these are going to be very insulating. These come in standard E width. The fit is really good, actually. These had a really snug fit that I quite liked, especially that midsection, that interior arc that pulls in. You can really feel that kind of hug your foot in the middle and keep really anything else from sort of jiggling around. And Meermin does have storefronts in Manhattan, Paris, and Madrid. So if you're in those areas, you can try them on for yourself. As far as styling, these are not going to be your refined three-piece suit boots, right? You could maybe wear something like this with a suit, but you'd probably want like a tweed suit, something a little bit heavier. Of course, these are great with more typical boot outfits. Jeans, these go perfect with. Even like a heavier chino is fine. Again, the nice thing about dress boots, guys, is inherent in the name. They're kind of made to be very versatile as far as boots go. This is among the most rugged of the dress boots on this list, and yet you could still wear this with chinos on a night out. That's like the beauty of Chelsea boots, right? The whole point is that you can kind of do anything with them, and that's why I personally really like them, along with not having laces, because who wants to deal with laces? I don't wear anything with laces these days, unless I can lace them up once and just slip them on. All right, let's do imperfections. On the left boot, which is this one right here, you got a sole stitch overlaps. Okay, the sole stitch overlaps these studs on the sole. There's a loose thread on the top line at the rear. There's a misplaced yellow thread at the front of the top line pattern, and then also a misplaced yellow thread at the rear of the top line. This comes from that inside thread on the lining. Quick note on that, I forgot. That's kind of cool that they actually matched the color of the thread. There's a scratch on the welt finish on the exterior side of the heel. There is visible glue at the toe welt joint, and the sole stitch is uneven in its spacing from the edge of the welt on the interior side. On the right boot, there is a welt stitch snafu on the exterior, twice. The top line has a flappy exterior corner. There is again a yellow thread on the rear of the top line and one on the front as well. And the finish is messy where the sole meets the top lift. On both boots, the corner of the sole and top lift edge is unfinished. You can see little flaps of rubber hanging off. There's a lasting rumple at the bottom of the goring on the interior side. The heel stitch is a little bit uneven and lopsided, although it is better on the right boot. Both of the two welt joints from the 270-degree welt are not flush. The finishing of that heel rand is just not great. It's a little too gritty and uneven. There's a gouge in the sole edge on the interior side. The heel layers are a little uneven and wavy, and then the top line edge is messy and unfinished, which some people might like as a sort of natural touch that reflects the suede. So 50-50 on that. And that's it. Now, this next boot is, to my mind, the most polarizing. And that is because this sexy beast is the Destrier Hatch Grain Chelsea boot by Indian bootmaker Blackbird. This is the only boot on this list built with a more heritage design philosophy. It's durable, stocky, and robust, but still has some features that give it a dressy look. Why do I think it's polarizing? Well, it arguably beats Bridlen in quality for the price, being fully handmade with a specialty leather that we will talk about, and it's literally the only brand making stitched leather footwear under $500 that will take custom requests for just about anything. Very few do custom requests at all, and only in limited scope. But just as its highs are high, so too are its drawbacks significant. I want to start with the good stuff first, but see if you can figure out those drawbacks along the way. Let's start out with construction because, boy howdy, do these have something to show. Now, these are fully handmade boots, which sounds impressive, and that's because it is, especially when you consider you don't typically find fully handmade footwear until over $600-700. But handmade doesn't mean good, it just means handmade. You can still hand make something quite poorly. So the question is, are these even good? The answer might surprise you, and we'll get to it in a moment, but first, what even is handmade? Because it does have a proper definition beyond the marketing fluff. Handmade refers to three primary operations involved in the creation of a stitched leather footwear: hand lasting, hand welting, and hand sole stitching. Hand lasting refers to the stretching of the leather over the last itself. This is normally done by machine, but can be pulled by hand and actually nailed down to the last. This carries a couple of benefits. You can have a more refined last because you have better dexterity when manipulating that leather, and you can get better articulation with stiffer leathers. The second is hand welting, which refers to that welt stitch that binds the welt through the upper layers to the insole. And then hand sole stitch, which refers to that sole stitch binding the outsole to the welt. Both of those can result in a tighter footbed that is lighter, more breathable, and also lasts quite a bit longer. Being hand welted typically comes with a channeled insole, which as we saw on Bridlen allows you to use a thicker insole. So that's what handmade actually is. So the question is, why are all these companies making Goodyear welted and Blake stitch shoes using this term handmade? Well, the big thing is this is not actually a term regulated by any particular institution, rather a common understanding among shoemakers. Many companies use this term because it is, of course, very appealing to consumers. Some grace has to be given to these companies because while a Goodyear welted or Blake stitch shoe isn't actually handmade, there are parts of that process done by hand. And between the fact that most customers don't actually know these super niche technical definitions of footwear and the fact that, those shoes and boots really are handmade when compared to like something you buy at Nike that's literally printed from a machine, I think it's reasonable. But let's take a look inside. Take a look at this picture and tell me what you think of this footbed. To me, it is shockingly well done. When we look at the toe cross-section, there are literally no gaps at all. You can see both of those outsole and welt stitches done. And you can actually see those nail holes from where the leather was wrapped around and nailed down to the last. And as we move through the footbed, the cork is tightly packed all throughout and also very, very thin. Again, any form of welted construction will have that gap between the insole and the outsole, but hand welting results in a far narrower gap. Then as we move to the heel, no gaps anywhere in the footbed, even where there's just like such a thin little bit of cork. You can actually see on this one the leftover of that screw driven into the heel to hold the heel stack together. I don't want to be gratuitous, but I also don't want to undersell the fact that there is no other company that I know of doing this kind of handwork at this low a price. And as we're going to see a little bit later, the quality of this construction actually rivals that of the most expensive boot on this list.
Hey, you're finally awake.
Now these have a double-studded Vibram outsole, a full-grain leather heel stack, and a thick full-grain leather insole. Pretty good flexibility on this outsole. I want to take a moment again to appreciate the beauty of it, especially the top lift on this one. It might be kind of silly or benign, but to me the appreciation of a fresh outsole comes from the inevitable ephemerality of it. The fact that it'll be forever changed the moment you wear the boot, which is something you'll inevitably do. The cork bed here is very thin and also extremely tightly packed. You will have less shock absorption compared to something like Bridlen or TLB, but in my opinion, I'd rather have the handmade construction. Plus, with a rubber sole, I think it's kind of a non-issue. And then the steel shank, which again, like Meermin, is a solo shank and it is riveted to the insole itself. Here, I'm less concerned about the solo shank. Given how thin and tightly packed the cork is, I think uneven displacement is a lot less of an issue here. So having a solo steel shank might honestly just save a little bit of space and weight compared to a combo one. The heel pad is a thick, dense foam and extends pretty far into the midfoot. Blackbird in general has a bit more emphasis on cushioned comfort. All their footwear actually comes with 2 optional thickly padded insoles, which can also help if you're more accustomed to the padding that a thicker Goodyear welted cork bed provides. You've got a full leather sock liner that extends the entire length, and then a leather lining that actually is not standard at all, but is in fact almost paper thin, which we'll talk about in a minute. We still have a black interlining though, and then a Celastic toe stiffener and Celastic heel counter. Something that is pretty cool is that this is the first boot on this list that has a suede heel counter. Typically, heels are always made a little on the bigger side because a slightly too big heel is totally wearable if the rest of the boot fits well, but a heel that's too tight is unwearable. So that suede helps mitigate any moving around that could cause blisters on your heel. You see it more on shoes than you do boots, and that's because shoes you have a real threat of your heel kind of slipping out, whereas on boots you have that shaft holding the whole boot to your foot, but it's nice to have. The goring, pretty standard rectangular lattice structure, and the pull tab, which is a unique choice here. It's actually made from the same leather as the upper. Now this, at first, I thought was actually pretty cool, and while I still think it's pretty cool, it turns out after using it, it comes with some pretty big drawbacks, but we'll save that for the design section. But this is great for construction. To be perfectly honest, guys, I expected these to be good because I've already cut in half a Blackbird shoe, but before I cut that one in half, I actually expected these to be pretty poorly made on the inside because handmade is really impressive, and to do it at this price, you wouldn't really expect a top-tier handmade quality. Like I said, the highs are high, and we will get to those drawbacks, but first, let's talk about the leather because it is special. This is Cognac hatch grain from Horween Tannery in the USA. Again, another very famous, very historic tannery that provides to a lot of bootmakers, especially for more rugged heritage styles. The Cognac is a rich, saturated, almost orange-tinted medium brown, complemented by a black patina on the toe and the heel, and that black dye rippling through the texture of that hatch grain. This also comes in burgundy if you want a little more of a maroon color. It's really the star of the show, and honestly why this boot is even on this list. If you still want a boot that's kind of rugged but also elevated in its own unique way, this is a great way to pull that off. Because it's textured, it'll hide any scars or scuffs much better than anything else. If you really need to stomp around in the mud or the woods a bit with any boot on this list, this should be that boot. And part of that is the thickness of the leather. So this still comes in at around 3 millimeters like everything else, except instead of that thickness being divided evenly between the lining and the upper, it's almost entirely the upper. An extra millimeter of thickness might not sound like a lot, but let me tell you, it sure feels like a lot. The leather is stiff. Now, this is more of a personal thing. Again, when we're talking about heritage style boots, typically you actually want a thicker leather because those boots are usually made for working. People who, a cinder block, a log, a big rock might actually fall on their foot. Within the context of this video, which is about dress boots that prioritize comfort and aesthetic, it's categorically a drawback. What you get in durability and protection, you give in flexibility and comfort. Leather this thick, even with skilled handwork, simply can't be articulated with much finesse, and it makes the last of this boot something that should be a highlight, one of its weakest features. This is the FF4B. It comes with a chiseled toe. However, in my opinion, I think the chiseled toe just comes across as a little too square. It's too wide in the forefoot, which instead of making it look kind of chiseled and contemporary and stylistic, to me it just reads as dumpy and unelegant. I think an almond toe would be great on a boot like this. It's a nice in-between from chiseled and round, where round is totally classic and chiseled is fully contemporary and stylistic. Almond is a really nice way to have a classic toe that still has a little bit of stylish flair, and I think that'd fit well here, because I also think a chiseled toe on a boot like this sort of competes with the leather itself. And this, to me, is an example of Blackbird doing too much with its design, and that's going to be a common theme throughout the rest of this review. Now, because Blackbird does custom orders, the silver lining is you can actually get this in an almond toe. The heel does have a nice roundness to it, although you can see as it moves up the shaft, even though the line should be straight, it's all kind of rumpled and warped because of the thick leather, making it really hard to last the model of the boot. And you see that everywhere on the vamp as well. There's just kind of these warping waves all around. You can really see it in the goring as well. Again, something that you can't really do anything about. I wouldn't even call it a defect in the sense that it's a quality control thing. I think all these boots are going to look like that just as a function of the leather. But even if we look past the warping leather, it's hard to put into words, so I'll lean on the image comparison here. It feels like it's trying to do what Bridlen is doing, but number one, doesn't quite have the finesse that makes Bridlen work, and more importantly, number two, has this wonderful leather that should take the spotlight alone, but instead has to compete with the last, which would still be an issue even if it did have the finesse. And in my opinion, the chiseled toe is the fundamental problem causing this. To be fair, this is probably less of a concern with a boot like this, given, you're probably not going to wear something like this with slim chinos. You're going to wear it with an outfit that has a lot of attention going on otherwise. Textured clothing, heavier clothing, and the texture of the boot itself kind of masks that. But something I think is a bit tragic, because this is so close to being perfection, and that really just pulls it away. So I think the last itself, I think, is just not great compared to the others on this list, but then the warping from the stiff leather really pushes it down. It's sunny here. Now move.
If there's a machine called a Goodyear welt that does it more quickly, why do you do hand welting instead?
We wanted to make boots the traditional way, and we wanted to make use of whatever skill was available to us. It has always been such important to offer jobs to our highly skilled laborers and give back to the community in some form or the other. People love wearing something that's harder to make and that has been made by having a lot of skill involved in making it.
All right, so the bottom corner of the edge of the sole is not beveled, unlike TLB Mallorca. On TLB, it just gives the boot a little bit of lift, where Blackbird has a more brick-like visual weight. That's totally fine at this price, but I point it out because it really illustrates just how much of an impact just a small little bevel like that can have. The sole edge itself is sanded perfectly flush between the rubber and the welt. The welt and heel stack leather is sanded uniformly and finished to a kind of textured, almost wooden finish similar to Meermin. There's no beveled waist here, square on both sides, and the welt fudging is a similar style to Beckett Simonon, but I think probably the weakest of all boots. It's just kind of messy. The impressions themselves are mostly uniform in density and depth, but there's kind of what looks like a half-hearted bevel going on throughout the whole edge that varies a bit and just really makes this kind of messy look, the way the light bounces off of it. There are 3 heel layers aside from the outsole and top lift. They are sanded very flush and dyed uniform. The stitch density of the sole stitch visible on the welt is about 4.5. It is fairly well done, especially for being done by hand. You can see a little bit of inconsistencies here or there, but the fact that it's so tight to the upper, I think makes up for it. The stitch density of the upper is 12 stitches per inch. Pretty good. It is uniform just about all around, except right there at the corners of the goring where we usually see the spacing tighten up a little bit. And then this front accent panel. So I actually really like this. It does have a function. It is there to help mold the leather to the last. Just makes it a little bit easier than when it's one whole piece curving around that top side. But it also adds as a nice decorative touch. I've mentioned this boot kind of doing too much in terms of decoration, when really it should just be quite plain and let the leather speak for itself. I actually think this accent panel is okay. I still think it does a good job of not taking away from the leather, but just adding an accent to it. And then the back stay here on the heel, the back strip, it is well done. It's perfectly straight. It's got a little bit of waviness to it, but that's more, I think, from the lasting rumples than the actual strip itself. The stitching on it is great, looks uniform. And then the goring has this more narrow, sharp design than the others we've seen. It's got a fairly acute angle here at the front, and then it also tapers up the midsection. The goring, to me, is a prime example of trying too hard with the design of this boot. Again, the leather is doing the talking here. Just having this leather on a handmade boot is all you need for this to be a great boot. But you have the chiseled toe, you have the accent panel too, and now you have this goring, which is very distinctly stylized. This whole boot is robust, it's big, it's strong and durable and heavy, and you have this goring design that's kind of elegant and dainty, right? It's sharp, it's narrow, it's acute. To me, it's a total mismatch. I think a better goring shape would just be, again, a very standard, simple design, maybe closer to TLB Mallorca, something a little more rectangular. And check this out, Photoshop whiz here. I actually put TLB Mallorca's goring on Blackbird to look at the difference. Tell me that doesn't look better. Is it just me? It might just be me because I made it, but I'm telling you, I just think it works. I think it looks so much more cohesive with a goring that is more broader and reflects the overall broad aesthetic of the boot. Tell me I'm great. Tell me what you think. Literally, actually comment below. Please comment below. People say that and no one does the comment. Write the comment. I want to know what you think. I'm going crazy over this. I'm telling you, I really think It looks better with this goring. But you tell me what you think. Don't be influenced by my judgment. They asked if they could, not if they should. And that is a great description of the pull tab. Because this pull tab, I opened the box and I was like, wow, this is so cool. What a great idea to add novelty and uniqueness to what is otherwise a pretty much identical facet of every single Chelsea boot. And after wearing them around, I think it adds another thing too, and that's a huge pain in the ass. This leather is textured, but it is smooth. And this is not easy to grip. It is not easy to grip. It's small. It doesn't flex like a normal polyester, so you can't quite wrap it around your finger to get that friction. It's extremely inconvenient from a functional standpoint, especially because this boot is already stiff and a little bit tricky to get on, and is the heaviest boot here at 589 grams or 20.8 ounces. And not only that, but it affects comfort, and comfort, much like the last, is a huge drawback with these. This boot has a rough break-in period. This leather on the Vamp dug into my toes, and it's stiff leather, so it really put the pressure on. After walking in all these other boots for just a few hours, for a few days, I didn't even think about comfort. These were categorically not comfortable, still, after a few days. The only thing that wasn't a big deal was the sole, which is also arguably the least important facet of comfort. The toe thing did start to ease up pretty quickly, but the bigger thing is the ankle. These were stiff around the ankle. I mean, it literally felt like my lower calf was in a PVC pipe. And the pull tab does not help with that, right? Because not only is the pull tab there, and it's just like this really stiff element that kind of rubs against your leg, but it also adds literally 2 extra layers of leather to that top edge. So that rear of the boot itself, it's like probably 5 or 6 millimeters of stiff leather. You know, honestly, even if you spent an evening in front of the TV just kind of pinching around the top line, that might actually kind of solve the problem faster, at least, than just wearing it. But that's something you'd probably need to do. So that was rough. And now a lot of people are going to watch this and be like, Chris, like, whatever, dude, that's what it's like to wear a heritage boot. It's like, yeah, well, these are supposed to be comfortable. All the boots on this list are supposed to be comfortable. That's what I'm prioritizing. Now, obviously, these are still on the list, and I chose to put them on the list. And part of that is because I know there's a lot of people who won't care about that. Right, there's a lot of people who comment saying, Chris, I don't care about that. I'm still happy with what this boot is because it's an insane value for what it is, which is true. It's not really about what I personally feel. It's about me kind of showing you guys things that I think you would find helpful or interesting to know about. As far as ground feel, again, these have pretty good ground feel, very close to the ground, given they're hand welted with a thin footbed. If you don't like that, you can use the added foam insoles. They'll definitely help. They're also nice for if you feel like the fit is a little bit big. You can use those to give you just a more snug fit. These do have a looser, more jiggly fit compared to all the other boots. It's hard to say because they felt kind of loose all around, like almost to the extent that I could have sized down half a size and gotten them right. But I'd also be concerned that if I sized down half a size, they would like be too uncomfortable to wear, like that Vamp digging into my toes especially. You know, so I think it's something where you buy a boot like this, you wear it around a bunch, and then when it softens up a bit, you can use that foam insert to give you a more snug fit if that's something you want, right? A lot of Americans I know prefer kind of looser fits, wider fits, especially on their boots. So that's something to think about. Now these by standard run a little wide. They are a single E-width. However, because of Blackbird's custom program, you can email them and get literally any size you want, any width, and for not much of an upcharge, if any at all. As far as styling, these are, of course, a bit more rugged. I don't know that I would see myself wearing something like this with a suit. Maybe you could with a heavier kind of tweed suit, something very wintry. But otherwise, I think this is just going to be great for like everyday use, casual use. It's a great way to have a more elevated boot that still fits with rugged outfits, where some of the more finessed boots on this list might look a little out of place. And then, of course, from a functional standpoint, the thicker leather, the Vibram outsole, fully handmade, these are going to be very, very durable and last quite a long time. But let's wrap this up with the imperfections. Not many here, only one on the left boot that I could find, and that is a snafu on the welt around the middle on the exterior side. On the right boot, the rubber on the sole edge just has a little snafu, also on the middle of the exterior side, and then the finish of the welt joint on the interior just gets a little messy, a little warped. Then on both boots, there are small lasting rumples all around. We talked about that in the leather section. The alignment of the front accent panel edge is a little uneven. The welt just doesn't look great overall. Again, we talked about that. And then the goring is also fairly wonky and warped, related to the lasting rumples. So this is a funny boot because I feel like I just spent the first half of this section totally overselling it. I'm going to get comments about how much of a Blackbird shill I am. And then the second half of this section dunked on this boot for what feels like half an hour. But that's also why I started this section saying that it feels like the most polarizing to me, because this is a boot that has so much that I love about it and think is such an amazing value, but also a few things that I think totally stop it from being as glorious as it could be, like totally stop short its potential. For me, I think the last could be a little bit more finessed, the goring shape, but then the big thing is I would love to see this same Horween hatch grain leather used, but just sanded down on the interior side to that 1.5, 1 millimeter thickness so that it's actually comfortable. I don't know how expensive that would be. Honestly, this boot could be $100 more and it would still be worth it, because if this didn't have the few major problems it has, this is a boot that could be worth $600, $700, $800. Under $1,000, these next boots, in no uncertain terms, are the absolute finest Chelseas I have ever seen or heard about. And I'm so convinced of it that if you don't feel the same by the end of this section, I want you to unsubscribe, dislike the video, and comment below telling me I'm fat and my hairline's receding. Don't do that. Please don't. I don't know why. Don't do. This is the BTS 211, a Chelsea boot made in a small workshop in Chengdu, China called Yearn Shoemaker, and sold through London specialty retailer Arterton London. Now these are fully handmade, just like Blackbird's Destrier, but the way they're put together is quite different, and it shows up in some very particular design features. And guess what? There's some details here that some might find pretty controversial. Sorry, Nick. Australia isn't real, and neither are you. I'm getting wild now. We're doing this boot in reverse. Design details first, then I'll open them up and show you exactly how that unique construction creates them. We'll talk more about the overall design in the last section, but one thing to know is that, in my opinion, these are the most contemporary boots on this list. As opposed to being more bulbous, round, and static, like many classic English designs, these have a more direct, linear, visual forward motion to them that is striking. And I want you guys to think about, as we go over each feature, how those add to that overall aesthetic. Starting with, okay, you know what? Oh my God. I'm just gonna do the B-roll. Starting with the outsole, while we've seen some nice finishes on the other boots on this list, this is the first truly luxury finish. Burnished to a high gloss and dyed to a deep, rich black. I personally really like dark soles, especially the way they highlight the decorative brass nails, which are on both the toe and heel. And these have a closed channel sole. With Bridlen, we saw how this is done by machine, but guys, take a look at how this is done by hand. These clips are from Japanese shoemaker Ken Kataoka on YouTube. Beautiful videos that capture the art of bespoke shoemaking. I strongly recommend checking them out. The waist of the sole is beveled, a roundness that is also reflected in the concavity of the heel stack itself. And I didn't mention it on some of the other boots because it looks nice, but it's nothing that I thought was notable. Here, there's something about the way this curve mirrors the rear curve of the heel stack itself that I think just sort of sings, which I know sounds a little abstract and some people might not like the way that sounds, but sometimes these abstract terms are the best way we can really describe how a design makes us feel. The combination top lift, you'll notice here compared to the other boots, the rubber is much smaller and much more distinctly shaped. I really like it here. It's a small thing, but it sort of turns that half rubber component as opposed to being like an intrusive but necessary facet of the top lift. It makes it look more like a visual accent. By the way, yes, we are glazing. I'm going to be glazing this boot, guys. It's Glaze City over here. I mean, these are the nicest boots on the list. I don't know if that comes across bad to anyone, but that's what it is. And yeah, I'm saying glazing now, I guess. That's just part of my vocabulary now. I don't know, my brain is fried, dude. The sole edge has a subtle bevel on that bottom corner, just giving a little bit of roundness so you don't have a sharp edge. That same thing we talked about with TLB. The sole edge itself is sanded perfectly flush, dyed a uniform black all throughout, and finished to a soft gloss. And the welt fudging on this is pretty wild. Now, we've talked about the decorative function of welt fudging, but guys, the original purpose of it actually is to demarcate where the stitches should be placed for the shoemaker. And what that means is welt fudging in its truest form isn't just some decorative pattern that a bootmaker can take creative liberties with. It's a very specific, deep, imprinted ridge, which also coincidentally serves as one of the best forms of framing of that upper because of how intentional that design looks. And here it's like pretty crazy. It's finished to a high gloss in a way that makes it almost look ceramic. Like there's a very hard looking quality to that material that I think many of the others lack. It's uniform in density and depth all around and tapers off cleanly at the midsection. Even the camera can't quite pick up just how special these look. They're like tiny mountains or something. And then as we move towards that midsection, we see the beveled waist where the sole edge goes from square to rounded. Just look at how much lighter it makes the boot look and feel visually. We've talked about how thicker sole edges on boots like Meermin can kind of give them this heavy quality that isn't particularly appealing, especially for a dress boot. Here, not only is the sole edge itself fairly thin, but that beveled waist really sells that illusion further. And beyond that, on the interior side, the waist pulls in very sharp. This is called a blind waist, specifically because it literally disappears from the top side and is done by folding in that welt in a way that allows the shoemaker to actually hide the stitch inside the boot. And take a look at this comparison. Really think about how that waist pulling in creates this visual lightness to this boot that the others don't quite have. And features like these and the dyed outsole, these are things that really start to turn what's simply a nice looking pair of footwear into more of a sculptural three-dimensional work of art. And for anyone who kind of turns their nose up at some of these more refined features, that's kind of what I would encourage you to look at these as. Like, don't think of these too much as just boots that kind of look nice, right? If you're buying something like this, it's not because you need a pair of boots for $700. It's because you're kind of buying a work of art, right? Moving to the heel, we have 4 layers aside from the outsole and top lift, and they are perfectly level and even in thickness. They are sanded perfectly flush and dyed to that rich kind of blackish dark brown. It's cut very tight to the heel itself, where even on a slimmer last like this, that upper is still stretching just a little beyond the heel block. And then on top of that, we actually have a new feature here as well with the heel block, another one, which is the pitch on it. So this is a pitched heel. It's actually pitched in 2 ways. It's pitched both forward and pitched down. So there's a taper as the heel stack goes from top to bottom. The downward pitch is a little more common and again adds lift to the boot, preventing that kind of platformed brick-like look. But to me, I think that forward pitch is far more special and also far more unique. I rarely see that. And it really, again, just such a subtle touch adds to that forward, linear, direct motion that you get with this product. The welt joint is literally perfect. I often myself have to kind of search a little bit to find it. It's perfectly flush and dyed evenly. You can only just barely in the right light make out that seam. The density of the sole stitch is 7 on these, and then the upper is 14. And then the goring shape. It's similar to TLB with no taper going up or down, though it does have a rounded bottom. I think it works here. I'd be really curious actually to see what it would look like with a taper. I'll probably Photoshop that in. Because I'm inclined to think it would work better with a slight taper going up the shaft, but it also works well enough that I really honestly could be wrong about that. What I do really like is that it has a forward slant to it as it goes down, which mirrors the forward slant of the heel block itself. And then two special details. I really like this ridge at the top of the goring. We've seen ridges on some of the others, but none of them seem too intentional. Here, this feels very intentionally decorative, and I think it just adds this really nice visual line. It makes that edge feel a little more finished and makes the whole product feel a little more complete compared to the others. And similarly, that stitch at the bottom of the goring, instead of going straight down, is also angled forward. And I love seeing things like that, and I think that's part of what makes a Chelsea so special, because there's not a whole lot you can do here. It's a minimal boot to begin with. So seeing how each individual maker kind of plays with these really, really small facets of design is really special, because it's easy to look at a boot that has a lot going on and say, oh, they've been really creative and done something really cool. But I think the real creativity comes out when you're limited to just a few choices and you have to make something unique and special with that limited toolkit. Now, before we wrap up design elements, I do want to mention there are a few alternatives you guys can get if you want to push this a little further. Arterton does offer an artisanal line, which is effectively the same boot, but with a few additional upgrades. That rounded beveled sole can be turned to a proper sharpened fiddleback. You can get a toppy or toe plates, which both add their own form of durability and a design element. Custom shoe trees as well. I really like Arterton's shoe trees. I've talked about them before. Really, really beautiful, basically works of art in of themselves. And then custom leather. You can literally customize the leather to like basically any of the options they have available. Definitely worth checking out. All right, now let's talk about the last. But first I'm gonna move spots because my butt hurts on this rock. So this last is, as you can probably imagine, pretty special. What makes it special, I think, is not just that it's a nice last, but that it really shows us why being hand-lasted makes a difference, how being hand-lasted makes a difference. We'll touch on that at the end, but first let's cover the fundamentals. This is Yearn's Y02 last. It has a smooth curve from the top line down to the toe, an asymmetrical slope along the exterior of the vamp, and a rounded heel that transitions smoothly up the top line and has no delineation where that heel counter is. And take a look at the S curve that's formed from the heel as it goes up to the top line. This is really one of those small qualities that no one would really even think about. You really have to look at the boot from a specific angle that you wouldn't normally to see truly the finesse of how this is put together. Moving back to the front, you have this beautiful arc on the interior as the leather wraps underneath the foot, and then we have a tapered almond toe. It would be so easy to chisel this, but I think choosing a rounded toe for this really demonstrates a level of restraint that keeps this boot within the category of being classic and away from the category of being too much. There's already a lot here that's distinguishing this boot as contemporary. And with regard to hand lasting, while I can't point out any specific quality that's definitively allowed by the fact that it's hand lasted, there's just a level of sophistication and refinement to the overall last, the ways in which the leather tucks into the welt, how it wraps tightly underneath into the blind stitch, the smoothness of that heel curve, the slimness of the overall last, those subtle facets that together compose a product that has substantially more finesse than anything else we've looked at, is really something that can only be done with a hand-lasted boot. Overall, it's slim, it's light, it's elegant, and it's something that even if you don't like it, if it's not your personal taste, I think there's a lot of respect to be had just for the level of craftsmanship and artistry that's going on in something like this. And again, it's why I really choose Chelsea boots to talk about last design, because other shoes and boots that have more decoration, lacing, stitching all over, it just makes it really hard to appreciate the subtleties of curvature and shape in that last. Well, let's talk about the leather that is on that last. So, this comes from Weinheimer. It is a German tannery, pretty historic tannery. Again, one of these real high-end ones that makers are looking to when they're trying to find some of the highest quality leathers. It's a full grain calf that comes in black or brown. This is the brown, and it has this rich smoky patina at the toe, on the heel, and interestingly up the vamp, which is not something we've seen on any of the other boots, but I really like how it kind of wraps around the goring. It blends really nicely and just creates a level of complexity to the base color that really makes the aesthetic. This comes in just a hair over 2.5 millimeters, similar to TLB Mallorca. Very flexible. I actually found these to be a little more supple than TLB's leather. Very even, uniform pore structure all throughout. Really great visual clarity. The grain itself is actually a little more smooth than Annonay leather. I find the Annonay leather has a bit more almost depth to the actual texture of the pattern of the grain itself, where this is just slightly more smooth. Though that's something you're probably only going to pick up on if you like really look into it. So, the construction of these, as I mentioned before, is pretty special because they are handmade, but there's kind of some interesting things going on here that allow for some of the design elements we looked at, like the blind waist. But starting off high level, these are fully handmade, and much like Blackbird, which we just looked at, that means they are triple H. Hand-lasted, hand-welted, and hand sole stitched. Now, I'm not going to go over what exactly those are. If you want to know, I would just skip back to the Blackbird section. I map out what that actually means. But first, let's just take a look at the footbed as a whole. No gaps anywhere. There is that gap in the heel, and don't worry, we're going to talk about that. But otherwise, there's the gap created by the shank, which is perfectly normal as the shank has a vertical dimension to it. When we look at the toe, you can see that sole stitch very clearly and the welt stitch that cuts through the upper and into the channel of the insole. At the rear, we can see that same thing happening again. Now, guys, in this next section, we're going to cover materials. I want you to think about, as we go through, how each of these materials kind of come together to form some of these specific design features we talked about in those previous sections. And I also want you to think about how they compare to not only the other boots on this list, but specifically Blackbird, which is also a handmade boot. Starting from the bottom, we've got our half rubber, half leather top lift, a full leather heel stack, and a full leather outsole. Pretty good flexibility on this. We'll see more of that when we cover comfort. But this gap in the heel, what is that about? Because this is the first time I've ever seen that. At first, I thought it might be like a cost-saving thing, but that wouldn't really make sense. I can't imagine the labor would actually save on just a tiny bit of, heel stack leather. So I emailed Tim Liu, one of the owners of Yearn, and he clarified that this was actually to reduce the weight of the boot. That is so cool. That is sick. That is so cool. Is that not so cool? I've never seen that before. And it's so simple, but really smart. It's a really good idea. And you can see there is a screw running from the top part of the heel down to the bottom through that gap. So it is clearly held in place. I myself am not worried about it structurally depressing. Although I think just the existence of that gap creates a very subtle depression in the heel that actually helps with that sideways S curve that matches the arch of your foot. And this isn't something they market. This isn't on their website. They don't tell you about this, right? And that should kind of tell you a little bit about the maker's intention. And that's why I like looking at the inside of these products. What does a maker do when no one's looking? Some people might not like this, probably from a durability or material integrity standpoint. To those people, I would say, friendly reminder, these are dress boots. They're not work boots, they're not heritage style boots. Dress boots prioritize comfort and aesthetic. They do have the durability of a well-made stitched leather boot, but unlike most of my children, they're not made to be in a cobalt mine. Let's move on. Cork, pretty standard as far as handmade boots go, similar to Blackbird. It's just a very tight cork pack on this one, though still with a good amount of compression. And if you look closely at this half where the boot is cut closer to the edge, the cork layer thins out, where on the other half, which is cut closer to the center, that layer is thicker. That delta results in the beveled sole. We saw the fiberboard insert on Bridlen, which created an artificial beveled sole, but this is how the actual beveled sole is composed, with cork that is shaped into a slope. And then a fiberboard steel combination shank. I was a little surprised at fiberboard at this price at first, but then I sort of thought about it, and I guess there's not really anything else that it could be other than fiberboard. Of course, you saw Bridlen use leather as its combination part for the shank, but the problem with that is that leather, in order to serve that function, has to be pretty thick, which it is in Bridlen. But here you can see how thin this fiberboard is. A strip of vegetable tan leather that thin is not really going to give the structural integrity that you'd need from that part. Maybe like a carbon fiber would be a cool like level up from just a fiberboard. I'm not sure, to what extent that's actually viable, but I just thought it's worth noting. Then the full leather insole. And take a look here. You see these little dots on the insole? Those are really far on the interior of the boot, and that's because that is the welt stitch that forms the blind waist, which you don't see on any of the other boots because normally that'll be closer to the edge of the boot. But here, because that welt is folded in, that stitch happens closer to the center of the actual footbed. And you can also see the upper and lining that's been folded underneath and tucked deep within the footbed itself. So cool. Is that not cool? It's cool. Then we've got a particularly thin foam heel pad and a leather sock liner. I do really like the decorative trimming on the edge of the sock liner and the decorative stitch. I thought it was stitched to the insole itself, but it's actually not. It is actually glued down. That stitching is just decorative. This is a half sock liner, which shows off not only the full leather insole, but also the nail holes of that insole that come from hand lasting. Then the suede heel counter. This suede backing on the heel here, which helps hold your heel in place, reduce any friction that might cause any kind of blistering. This is only one of 2 boots on this list that have a suede heel counter, the other being Blackbird. But this suede not only is bigger and has more coverage around the heel, but this is also a higher quality suede that's a bit nappier with a bit longer of a hair. A buttery soft, light colored calfskin lining, a standard white interlining, and then the upper leather itself. For structure, there's a Celastic toe stiffener and a Celastic heel counter. We've talked about Celastic toes before in this video. Not really a big deal and arguably better than a leather board, for example. A full grain leather may be better than a thermoplastic. That's typically something you'd see in the bespoke range, like over probably $1,500. However, the heel, that's a little bit of a different story. Probably the only thing about this boot that I consider a little disappointing is having that Celastic heel. Really, even below this price, you'd expect to see a leather board. For what it's worth, I didn't feel it at all. I didn't feel any discomfort from it when walking around. So ultimately, is it something you should care about? Well, that's kind of up to you. Pretty standard goring here. Similar to TLB, it has a little more dynamic diagonal of a pattern than the normal rectangular lattice structure. And then the pull tab, which, like the others, is just a polyester nylon. However, it does have the finest weave of all the pull tabs on this list, and also has this nice luster to it that I kind of like and is enhanced by the fineness of the weave. Again, not really a big deal, but it's nice to see the quality being pushed even in these what are otherwise kind of benign elements of the boot. And that's the construction. But once again, as close as these are to works of art in of themselves, they are not works of art. They are boots, and boots must be worn. They must be styled. They must be comfortable. So let's take a look at that. These come in at actually the lightest of all the boots at 421 grams or 14.9 ounces. Do you remember that gap in the heel block? I'm willing to bet that if that was filled in, these would actually be just slightly heavier than Beckett Simonon. I didn't plan that, of course, but I think that's a really cool demonstration of how much it really matters to have those small pieces taken out for that lightness. And you can feel it. When you walk around in these, you can really feel how light they are. Literally no break-in period for me. They were pretty much as comfortable as they got. I mean, I'm sure they got a little more flexible over time, but I didn't notice any discomfort at all when I first put them on. Good ground feel on these, right? That thin footbed really going to make you have good contact with the ground, especially the little more flexibility to that sole. Similarly, between the thin footbed and thin leather, these are very breathable. So these are great for warmer weather if you happen to be wearing them. You know, if you have issues with sweating, if you're in a very humid environment, something that's a little more breathable like this can really help you out. But of course, they come with the benefits of a welted shoe, unlike Beckett Simonon, where you can also walk on the streets after rain. If there's a puddle, if there's a little bit of wetness on the concrete, that's not going to wick up through that exterior thread and get into your socks. Plus, the closed channel sole is going to protect that thread anyways. You can get these in either standard E or F width. The fit on them is actually really interesting. You got to bear with me here. This is I've got something to say about fit here because I learned something really cool about Chelsea boots from putting these on. When I put these on, it was kind of a pain in the butt. Getting my foot into the boot, pulling the collar over it was kind of tricky. It felt very tight. And granted, I didn't use a shoehorn, which you can use a long shoehorn with Chelsea boots, which I do nowadays, and that helps out a lot. Actually makes it really, really easy. But once I got my foot in and started walking around, the fit literally felt how I would expect a bespoke boot to fit. A perfect snug fit. I had no degree at all of my foot wiggling around, which is odd because they're not bespoke and the fit isn't perfect. The forefoot still had a little bit of space. The heel wasn't perfectly shaped to my heel. There should be at least a little bit of wiggling, even if it's no more than what you would regularly expect for a ready-to-wear boot, as is the case with all the others. So I really thought about this for a while, and what I realized is it actually came back to that really tight collar, that tight shaft, which hugged my lower calf and ankle more so than all of the other boots. Between that and the blind waist hugging my midfoot, it made my heel and forefoot not move around at all or wiggle independently of the boot. So even though there was space there wasn't any feeling of wiggling where you feel your foot actually hit and move around within the boot itself. Something similar happened with Bridlen, where that pronounced arch support hugging my midfoot made the rest of the boot kind of lock in place. But something about the ankle and lower calf being the most snug point of contact just did it for me. It comes with the minor annoyance of the boot being a little more frustrating to put on, I guess. But to me, at least, that's a small price to pay for a boot that felt like it was a bespoke fit. It was actually really fun to walk around in these. Anyways, color and formality, how would you use these? How can you style these? So these are, of course, if any boot on this list is a suit boot, these are the suit boots. These are so sharp. They're so sophisticated in the quality of the materials, the quality of construction, just the overall contemporary sharp aesthetic. I think no doubt at all these can fit well with a standard suit, like for example my hop sack, which is kind of like a medium weight, or even something a little bit lighter for summertime where maybe you just want to go out and you want to wear a more contemporary black Chelsea. This could be really cool with a lighter suit. Fall, spring, when it's kind of warming up, but it still gets a little cool in the evenings. Office, of course. This is nice enough that a heavy kind of wide cut jean might look a little out of place with this. Insofar as jeans work with something like this, you're probably want a little more slim cut jean, something a little more style forward. Certainly chinos, any kind of cool, warm weather night out, social night out kind of outfit, these would totally rock well with. They'd probably catch people's attention. You'd probably strike up really cool conversation. But even these, for how good they are not $3,000 and therefore are not perfect. So, what's wrong with them? On the left boot, there is a streak on the top lift. There's a loose thread on the bottom of the goring on the exterior, and the overlap of the panels at the bottom of the goring on the interior is just slightly misaligned. And the pull tab angles forward. Okay, this is like, I'm bringing this up not because it really matters, but because this was a pain in my ass. See this pull tab? Do you see it? See how it's like bent forward like that? That's how it is. Like I can kind of bend it back, but it naturally, you can see it kind of flipping up and it'll just easily flip forward. See that? I feel like an idiot doing that. That was so annoying when shooting these boots. You guys don't realize the amount of time I spent to capture these shots beforehand, just going over and trying to like squeeze the pull tab in place only for it to flip back over. I can't. On the right boot, there are divots right around the toenails. The welt stitching at the toe just gets a little bit messy. There's a loose thread at the bottom of the goring on the interior. On both boots, the sole finish fades at the waist. There's a wrinkle at the rear of the top line, and there is stitching unevenness at the bottom of the goring. It just sort of tightens up around those corners. We've actually seen that on all these boots, so I wonder if it's somewhat inevitable. I'm not sure. Maybe just very difficult to fix. So that's it. Thanks so much, guys, for watching. I'll see you soon.